They say the most dangerous man in the North wasn't dangerous because he killed without mercy. He was dangerous because he killed without feeling anything at all. Prince Kyle Draven built his throne on the bones of men who thought they could challenge him, and every morning he woke up wondering if today was the day someone would finally be stupid enough to try. But here's what nobody tells you about being feared. The silence gets so loud it starts eating you from the inside. And when an Omega woman with dirt under her fingernails walked into his palace and looked at him like he was just another bully who'd forgotten what it cost to be human, everything he thought he knew about power started crumbling. Stick around till the end of this one. You're going to want to see how a kingdom built on fear gets torn apart by one woman who refused to be afraid. And hey, drop a like and comment with your city name so I know where my tribe's watching from. Papu. The throne room of Moonfang Palace smelled like old blood and older money. Caregiver Draven stood at the eastern window, watching the northern mountains turn purple in the dying light, his reflection sharp and cold in the glass. 26 years old and already the most hated man in 6 territories. His father used to say that was an accomplishment. His father had been dead 3 years now, throat torn out by an assassin who'd made it exactly 4 steps into the royal chambers before Kyle put him down like a sick dog. The Alpha Prince didn't sleep well anymore. Hadn't in years. But he'd learned something more valuable than rest. He'd learned that if you made people afraid enough, they stopped trying to kill you in your sleep. They just killed each other trying to prove their loyalty instead. Behind him, Chancellor Veyron cleared his throat like a man testing the thickness of ice before stepping onto it. Kale didn't turn around. Keep them guessing. Keep them scared. Your Highness, the orphans from the border settlements have arrived. 73 Omega children, ages 4 to 14. The temporary housing in the East Wing is... I didn't ask for a census, Veyron. I asked if they were contained. The Chancellor's pause was just long enough to be interesting. Contained wasn't exactly the word Kyle had used in the original order, but it was close enough. The war with the Rhymeclaw clan had been brutal and necessary. They'd been raiding supply routes for 2 years, stealing grain and medical supplies, leaving whole villages to starve. Kyle had ended it in 6 weeks with a scorched earth campaign that left no room for negotiations or mercy. The problem was all those orphaned Omega pups with nowhere to go and no one to take them. The nobility had suggested workhouses. Kyle had suggested something worse, then realized even he had limits he wasn't ready to cross yet. So now they were his problem. They're secured in the East Wing, Your Highness. However, there is the matter of supervision. The staff we've assigned has been insufficient. Several incidents of, hire someone competent then. This isn't complicated, Chancellor. Veyron shifted his weight. We have, Your Highness. She arrives this evening. Kale's reflection showed nothing. No surprise, no curiosity, nothing that could be used against him later. He'd perfected that mask when he was 12 years old, right after his mother died and the court vultures started circling. She? Celine Vale, from the lower districts. She's run an orphan sanctuary there for 6 years. Reputation for... The Chancellor paused, choosing his words like a man defusing a bomb, for being effective with difficult cases. Kale finally turned, and Veyron took an involuntary half-step backward. The prince's eyes were the color of winter storms, and just as warm. An Omega from the slums is going to teach my staff how to manage children in the royal palace. Is that what you're telling me? She came highly recommended by... I don't care if she was recommended by the gods themselves, Veyron. I want those pups quiet, fed, and invisible. If this woman can do that, fine. If she causes problems, she's gone. We clear? Crystal, Your Highness. Kale turned back to the window, dismissal in every line of his body. Veyron retreated like a man who'd just survived a near-death experience, which wasn't far from the truth. The prince listened to his footsteps echo away down the marble corridor, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 73 orphans. 73 reasons the war had been necessary. 73 reminders that necessity and righteousness weren't the same thing. He shoved the thought down deep where it couldn't touch him and went to get ready for the evening's court session. There were nobles to intimidate and alliances to break. The usual. Celine Vale arrived at Moonfang Palace just after sunset, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had been patched so many times it was more thread than fabric. The guards at the eastern entrance looked at her like she'd crawled out of a sewer, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. The lower districts didn't have the same standards for waste management as the upper city, and after 6 years running a sanctuary on donated scraps and sheer stubbornness, Celine had learned to stop noticing the smell. Name, the senior guard said, not quite meeting her eyes. The alpha superiority complex was strong in the palace staff, apparently. Celine Vale. I'm here for the children. The guard checked his roster, frowning. You're the new Omega handler? Celine felt her jaw tighten. She'd been called worse, but the clinical detachment in his voice made her want to correct him with her fist. I'm the new caregiver, she said evenly. Where are they? The guard jerked his thumb toward a side corridor. East wing, 3rd floor. Try not to get lost. Palace is bigger than whatever hole you crawled out of. The other guard snickered. Celine looked at the senior guard for a long moment, memorizing his face. Then she smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Thanks for the welcome. Real classy. She walked past them before they could respond, her worn boots making no sound on the polished marble. The palace was everything the lower districts weren't, clean, cold, and designed to make you feel small. Portraits of dead royals glared down from the walls like they could smell poverty. Chandeliers dripped crystal and contempt in equal measure. Celine had seen plenty of rich people in her life. Most of them had never done a day's work that left calluses. Most of them wouldn't last a week in the lower districts before someone separated them from their gold teeth and their illusions about how the world worked. She found the East Wing by following the sound of crying. The temporary housing turned out to be a series of converted storage rooms that still smelled like mothballs and forgotten things. 73 children packed into a space meant for furniture, sleeping on thin mats laid directly on the stone floor. No toys, no books, no goddamn warmth except what they could steal from each other by huddling close. A woman in a palace uniform was standing near the door, arms crossed, looking like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. You're the new one? Thank the gods. I've been here 12 hours, and I'm done. They won't stop crying, half of them won't eat, and 2 of them tried to bite me. Celine set down her bag. What are their names? The woman blinked. What? The ones who tried to bite you. What are their names? How should I know? There's 70 of them, and they all look the same. Celine felt something hot and sharp move through her chest. She'd felt it before. Every time someone looked at an Omega child and saw a number instead of a person. Every time someone decided that being powerless meant being worthless. Get out, Celine said quietly. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out. You're done here. The woman's face flushed. You can't order me around. I work for the palace, not some slum rat who... Celine stepped forward, and something in her expression made the woman's words die in her throat. Celine wasn't tall, wasn't imposing, wasn't anything that should have been threatening, but she'd spent 6 years standing between hungry children and a world that wanted to grind them into dust, and she'd learned how to make herself unmovable when it mattered. I'm giving you one chance to walk out that door with your dignity intact, Celine said softly. Take it. The woman stared at her for 3 full seconds, then turned and left without another word. Celine waited until her footsteps faded, then turned to face the room full of frightened eyes watching her from the shadows. Okay, she said, lowering herself to sit cross-legged on the floor. Here's how this is going to work. My name is Celine. I'm not going to hurt you, I'm not going to yell at you, and I'm not going to leave until you're all safe. But I need to know your names. All of them. So who wants to go first? Silence. 73 pairs of eyes, waiting for the trap. Celine settled in. She'd waited out longer silences before. 3 hours later, she had 42 names, 4 tentative smiles, and a splitting headache from the smell of unwashed bodies packed too close together. But it was progress. She'd also made a mental list of everything that needed to change, starting with the sleeping arrangements and ending with whoever had decided that feeding traumatized children nothing but cold porridge twice a day was acceptable. A few of the older kids had started talking once they realized she wasn't going anywhere. They told her about the attack on their village, about watching their parents die defending the grain stores, about the soldiers who'd rounded them up afterward like stray cattle. One girl, maybe 13, with a scar running from her temple to her jaw, had looked Celine dead in the eye and said, "The prince did this. Everyone says he's a monster. Are you going to let him hurt us too?" Celine had taken a long breath before answering. "I've never met the prince, but I promise you, nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here. Nobody. The girl had studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once and gone back to comforting a smaller child who wouldn't stop shaking. Now, with most of the kids finally asleep, Celine slipped out into the corridor to find whoever was in charge of palace housekeeping. The children needed clean blankets, warmer clothes, and actual beds. They needed a space that didn't make them feel like they were being stored until someone decided what to do with them. She was halfway down the hall when she heard voices echoing from around the corner. Male. Alpha. Drunk from the sound of it. Waste of space, if you ask me. Feeding and housing 70 Omega brats like they're actually worth something. Careful, man. The prince will hear you. The prince doesn't give a damn. You see his face when they brought them in? Cold as winter stone. He'd probably sell them all to the labor camps if the optics weren't so bad. Celine stepped around the corner. 3 guards, palace uniforms, wine on their breath. They stopped talking immediately when they saw her, surprise flickering across their faces before settling into something uglier. You lost, Omega? One of them said. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, casual threat in the gesture. No, Celine said, but you're about to be. Those children are under my care now, and I don't tolerate people who talk about selling kids to labor camps. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go find your supervisor, you're going to request reassignment away from the East Wing, and you're going to do it before I make it a formal complaint. The guard's expression shifted from surprise to amusement. A formal complaint. From an Omega. That's rich. His companions laughed. One of them stepped closer, using his height to loom over her. Listen carefully, little Omega. You might have some kind of arrangement with the staff, but don't forget where you are. This is the royal palace. We don't take orders from people like you. Celine held his gaze. People like me keep kids alive when the rest of the world stops caring. What do people like you do, besides drink wine and threaten women in hallways? The guard's face darkened, his hand tightened on his sword. For a moment, Celine thought he might actually draw it, and she mentally calculated how fast she could get back to the children's room and bar the door. Then a voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. Is there a problem here? All 4 of them turned. A man stood at the end of the corridor, backlit by torchlight, his silhouette sharp and predatory. Even without seeing his face clearly, Celine knew 2 things immediately. This man was an alpha, and he was dangerous. The guards straightened instantly, fear replacing bravado. Your Highness, we were just... The man stepped forward into the light, and Celine's stomach dropped. She'd never seen a portrait of Prince Caregiver. The lower districts didn't waste wall space on royalty, but she knew him anyway, the same way prey knows a predator. It was in the way he moved, the way the air seemed to tighten around him, the way the guards looked like they wanted to melt into the walls. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s maybe. Dark hair, storm-colored eyes, a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't so cold. He wore black on black, no crown, no ornamentation. He didn't need it. The power came off him like heat off a forge. His eyes locked onto Celine, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. You're the new caregiver, he said. Not a question. Celine forced her spine straight. Yes. And you're out of your assigned area because your guards were discussing selling children to labor camps, and I needed to make sure they understood that wasn't happening. The temperature in the corridor dropped 10 degrees. The prince's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He looked at the guards. Report to the captain of the guard in the morning. You're reassigned to the Northern Watchtower, effective immediately. Your Highness, that's a 6-month rotation. Did I stutter? The guards fled. Actually fled, like rats off a sinking ship. The prince watched them go, then turned back to Celine. His eyes were empty, calculating. She'd seen that look before, on men who were deciding whether you were useful or disposable. Let me make something clear, he said, his voice soft and absolutely merciless. You're here to keep those children quiet and out of my way. That's all. If you have a problem with how my guards conduct themselves, you report it through proper channels. You don't confront armed men in isolated corridors. You don't make scenes, and you certainly don't speak for me. Understood? Celine's hands curled into fists at her sides. Every instinct screamed at her to back down, to lower her eyes, to remember that this man could destroy her with a word. Instead, she met his gaze and said, Those children aren't going to be quiet. They're traumatized, they're grieving, and they're terrified. They need care, not containment. If that's a problem for you, you should have left them in the border settlements to die. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. The prince stared at her, really stared, like he was trying to figure out if she was suicidal or just stupid. Then he smiled, and it was the coldest thing Celine had ever seen. "You have no idea how much trouble you just bought yourself," he said quietly. "Sleep well, Omega. You're going to need it." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing long after he'd disappeared around the corner. Celine stood there for a full minute, shaking with adrenaline and fury, and something else she couldn't quite name. Then she went back to the children and didn't sleep at all. The next morning, Celine learned what the prince meant by trouble. She'd been awake for maybe 2 hours, organizing breakfast and trying to coax the most traumatized kids into eating something, when a palace steward arrived with a message. Her presence was required at the morning court session. "Why?" she asked. The steward looked uncomfortable. The prince requested it personally. Celine's stomach dropped, but she nodded. She got 2 of the older kids to watch the younger ones, promised she'd be back soon, and followed the steward through a maze of corridors to the throne room. It was even more intimidating than she'd imagined. Vaulted ceilings, marble columns, enough gold leaf to feed the lower districts for a year. Nobles packed the gallery, all silk and jewels and predatory interest. They looked at her like she was a new entertainment act. The prince sat on his throne like he'd been carved from the same stone, one hand draped casually over the armrest, his expression bored. He didn't look at Celine as she was escorted to the center of the room. Then he did, and his eyes were glacial. "Celine Vale," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "You're here because I want the court to understand something about how we maintain order in this kingdom." Celine's heart hammered. The nobles leaned forward, scenting blood. "Last night," the prince continued, "you confronted 3 of my guards in a palace corridor. You threatened them with formal complaints. You spoke as though you had authority here." He paused, letting the words hang. "I want everyone in this room to understand that you don't. Your staff, hired help. You have exactly as much power as I grant you, which is to say, none at all. If you have complaints about my guards, my staff, or my orders, you swallow them, because the alternative is that I decide you're more trouble than you're worth, and then you're back in whatever slum I pulled you from. Are we clear?" The nobles were eating it up. Celine could hear them whispering, laughing, enjoying the show. She looked at the prince, really looked at him, saw past the performance, past the cold mask, past the carefully constructed image of absolute power. And she saw what he was doing. He was making an example of her, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because he needed the court to see him crush someone. Because fear was how he ruled, and fear only worked if you fed it regularly. She should have lowered her eyes, should have apologized, should have played the game. Instead, she said, "Are you finished?" The throne room went silent. The prince's eyes narrowed. "What?" "I asked if you were finished, because I've got 73 kids who need me, and standing here while you perform for your court isn't helping them." Somewhere in the gallery, someone gasped. The nobles were staring at her like she'd just set herself on fire. The prince stood slowly. His alpha presence flooded the room, oppressive and overwhelming. Celine felt her knees want to buckle, felt every Omega instinct screaming at her to submit. She locked her legs and stayed standing. "You think you're brave," the prince said, descending the dais steps. "You think standing up to me makes you strong. It doesn't. It makes you reckless. It makes you dangerous to everyone around you." He stopped 3 feet away, towering over her. "Those children are alive because I allowed it. They have food and shelter because I provided it. You have a job because I permit it. Everything you have exists at my discretion. So when I tell you to remember your place, I'm not being cruel. I'm being merciful, because the alternative is showing you exactly how powerless you really are." Celine's throat was tight. Her hands were shaking, but she looked up at him and said, "If that's mercy, Your Highness, I'd hate to see your cruelty." The prince stared at her. Something flickered across his face too fast to read. Then he turned to the guards flanking the throne room entrance. "Escort Miss Vale back to her duties, and dock her pay for the next month. Call it a lesson in respect." The guards moved forward. Celine let them guide her toward the exit, her face burning with humiliation and rage. As she reached the doorway, she heard the prince address the court again, his voice cold and dismissive. "Let that be a reminder. Defiance has consequences, no matter who you are. The doors closed behind her, and Celine was alone in the corridor with two guards who wouldn't meet her eyes. She took a shaking breath, then another. Then she straightened her spine and walked back toward the east wing. The prince had tried to break her in front of his entire court. He'd failed, and now he knew it. Word spread through the palace like wildfire. The Omega from the slums had defied the prince. For the next week, Celine felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every barely concealed sneer from the staff. But she kept her head up and focused on what mattered: the children. She fought for everything they needed: better food, clean clothes, actual beds instead of mats on the floor, a physician to check the ones who were coughing, books, toys, windows they could actually see out of. Every request went through Chancellor Veyron, who looked more stressed each time she showed up in his office. Most of her requests were denied or delayed. The palace ran on bureaucracy and contempt in equal measure. But Celine was stubborn, and she'd learned a long time ago that if you just kept showing up, kept asking, kept refusing to go away, eventually people gave you what you wanted just to make you stop. The children started to change, slowly. The youngest one stopped flinching when she approached. The older ones started talking more, sharing stories about their lives before the war. A few even smiled. One afternoon, Celine was teaching a group of them an old counting game from the lower districts when she realized someone was watching. She looked up. The prince stood in the doorway, silent as a ghost. He didn't say anything, just watched, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and left. Celine's hands were shaking for an hour afterward. Boshiku. The confrontation came 2 weeks after her arrival. Celine was walking through the palace gardens, one of the few places she'd found where the air didn't smell like political backstabbing, when she heard shouting from the eastern courtyard. She ran. A group of palace guards had cornered 3 of her kids against a wall. One of them, a boy named Tam, who couldn't have been more than 10, was on the ground, blood running from his nose. "What the hell happened?" Celine demanded, pushing through the guards. The senior guard, a different one from the hallway incident, but cut from the same cloth, sneered at her. "Little thief tried to steal from the kitchen stores." "We caught him red-handed. He's 10 years old and he's hungry," Celine snapped. "That's not theft. That's survival. That's palace property. And palace law says theft gets punished." The guard drew his baton. Celine stepped between him and Tam. Her heart was trying to break through her rib cage, but she kept her voice steady. "You touch him again, and I'll report you to the captain of the guard personally." The guard laughed. "The captain doesn't care about some Omega brat from the border. Neither does the prince. They're here on charity, and charity doesn't cover breaking rules." He pushed past Celine and raised the baton. Without thinking, Celine grabbed his arm. The guard's face went red. He spun, shoving her back hard enough that she hit the ground. The other kid screamed, "You dare put your hands on a palace guard? You're done, Omega. You and every one of these—" A low, dangerous voice cut through his rant. "Finish that sentence. I want to hear how it ends." Everyone froze. The prince stood at the courtyard entrance, and for the first time since she'd met him, Celine saw genuine anger on his face. The guards went pale. The senior guard stammered, "Your Highness, she assaulted me. You raised a weapon against a child under palace protection," the prince said, walking forward. His voice was soft, lethal. "You struck an employee. You violated direct orders about the treatment of the war orphans." He stopped in front of the guard, and even though the prince was barely taller, the guard looked like he wanted to sink into the cobblestones. "You're dismissed from service, effective now. Get out of my sight before I decide that's not enough." The guard fled. His companions followed. The prince turned to Celine, who was still on the ground, breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice had lost some of its edge, but it was still cold. Celine shook her head. She didn't trust her voice. The prince looked at Tam, then at the other kids, then back at Celine. "Clean him up. And next time one of your charges needs food, submit a formal request instead of letting them steal." He turned to leave. Celine found her voice. "Wait." The prince stopped, didn't turn around. "Thank you," Celine said quietly, "for stopping him." The prince was silent for a long moment, then he said, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because disorder reflects poorly on the crown." And he walked away. That night, lying on her cot in the small room they'd given her adjacent to the children's quarters, Celine stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. The prince had saved Tam, had dismissed a guard for hurting him, had shown something that almost looked like humanity, but his words afterward had been ice cold, calculated. Like he couldn't stand the idea of anyone thinking he'd done something decent. Celine had met a lot of broken people in her 6 years running the sanctuary. She'd learned to recognize the ones who hurt others because they were cruel, and the ones who hurt others because they didn't know how to stop hurting themselves. She was starting to suspect the prince was the second kind, which was dangerous, because that meant part of her wanted to understand him. And understanding led to caring, and caring led to getting destroyed by men who burned everything they touched. She rolled over and tried to sleep. She dreamed about storm-colored eyes and walls too high to climb. But 3 days later, the palace held its monthly court assembly, a gathering where nobles brought petitions, grievances, and political maneuvering disguised as civic concern. Celine had no reason to attend, but Chancellor Veyron showed up at her door that morning with a summons. "The prince requests your presence," he said, looking like he'd rather be delivering any other message. "Why?" "I wasn't told, but I'd advise you to attend promptly and keep your opinions to yourself." Celine dressed in the cleanest clothes she had, which still looked shabby compared to anything palace adjacent, and followed Veyron to the throne room. It was packed. Every noble house in the northern territories seemed to be represented. They glittered like a jewelry box full of vipers. The prince sat on his throne, looking bored. He hadn't acknowledged Celine's entrance. The first few petitions were standard political theater: trade disputes, land boundaries, a request for increased guard presence in the western territories. Then Lord Corvin stood. He was a heavy-set man with a face like a cruel joke, dressed in enough velvet to upholster furniture. Celine had heard the other staff mention him: old money, older prejudices, and a reputation for treating Omegas like property. "Your Highness," Lord Corvin began, his voice carrying through the chamber, "I wish to raise a concern about the current state of the palace." The prince gestured lazily. "Speak. It has come to my attention that standards have slipped in recent weeks. Specifically, the decision to house and care for Omega war orphans within the palace walls has caused significant disruption." Celine's stomach tightened. "Several of my staff have complained about the noise, the smell, and the general disorder these children bring. Furthermore, the hiring of an unvetted Omega from the lower districts to supervise them is highly irregular. I move that we relocate these children to the workhouses where they can be properly managed and contribute to the kingdom's economy." Several nobles nodded. A few murmured agreement. Celine felt rage building in her chest like a living thing. The prince was silent, his expression unreadable. Lord Corvin pressed on. "These children are a drain on palace resources, Your Highness, and the woman caring for them has been openly disrespectful to guards and staff. Just last week, she physically assaulted—" "That's a lie," Celine said. Every head in the room turned toward her. Chancellor Veyron made a strangled sound. Lord Corvin's face reddened. "Excuse me?" Celine stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "I didn't assault anyone. I stopped a guard from beating a 10-year-old child with a baton. And if you call protecting kids from abuse disrespectful, then maybe your definition of respect is worthless." The throne room erupted. Nobles shouted. Veyron looked like he might pass out. Guards shifted uncomfortably. The prince still hadn't moved. Lord Corvin sputtered, "This Omega dares to speak to me like— How dare she address her betters without permission?" Celine laughed. It came out harsh and bitter. "Betters. You want to talk about betters? Those kids have more courage and decency than anyone in this room. They've lost everything and they're still fighting to survive. What have you ever fought for besides more gold and more power?" "Enough!" The prince's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The room went silent. He stood slowly, and Celine's stomach dropped as she realized she'd just made everything worse. The prince descended from the dais, his eyes locked on her. "Miss Vale," he said softly, "has just demonstrated exactly the problem Lord Corvin described: a complete lack of respect for hierarchy, authority, or her own position." He stopped in front of her. However, the word hung in the air like a sword about to fall. The prince turned to face Lord Corvin. "She's also correct. Those children have shown more resilience in 2 weeks than most of you have demonstrated in your entire lives." They're here because my war left them with no other options, and they'll remain here until I decide otherwise." He paused, letting the words sink in. "As for Miss Vale's employment, that's palace business, not yours." Lord Corvin's face went from red to purple. "Your Highness, surely you cannot allow an Omega to speak to nobility in such a manner without consequences." The prince's expression went cold. "What consequences would you suggest, Lord Corvin? Because the last man who raised a hand against one of those children was dismissed from service. Are you volunteering to join him?" The threat was clear. Lord Corvin opened his mouth, then closed it. He bowed stiffly and sat down. The prince turned back to Celine. His eyes were unreadable. "You're dismissed, Miss Vale. Get back to your duties before I remember that insubordination is usually grounds for termination." Celine met his gaze for one long moment. Then she turned and walked out, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. That night, Celine couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the throne room scene, the prince defending the children. Defending her, sort of, but still treating her like a problem to be managed. She was standing at the window of her small room, looking out at the palace gardens under moonlight, when someone knocked. Celine opened the door. The prince stood in the corridor alone. No guards, no entourage. Just him, still dressed in black, his expression unreadable. Her breath caught. "We need to talk," he said. And before Celine could respond, he walked past her into the room, closing the door behind him like he owned the entire world. Which, technically, he did. The prince closed his door behind him with a quiet click that sounded like a cell locking. Celine's room was barely 10 feet across. A cot, a wooden chair, a small table with a cracked basin. Not exactly built for hosting royalty. The prince looked around once, his expression unreadable, then turned to face her. "You have approximately 30 seconds to explain why you keep putting yourself in situations that force me to choose between executing you for insubordination and looking weak in front of my court." Celine's mouth went dry. The space felt smaller with him in it, like all the air had been sucked out through the floorboards. His presence wasn't just physical, it was atmospheric, oppressive, the kind of weight that made her lungs work harder just to function. "I didn't ask you to defend me," she said, keeping her voice level. "In the throne room. I can handle Lord Corvin on my own." The prince laughed. It was a harsh sound, no warmth in it. "You think standing up to him in front of 50 nobles was handling it? You just painted a target on your back. Corvin's got connections to half the trade guilds in the north. One word from him and you'll never work anywhere in this kingdom again. Then maybe I'll work somewhere else. There is nowhere else. I control 6 territories. Every port, every trade route, every scrap of arable land from here to the ice wastes. You want to run? Fine, but you'll be doing it broke, blacklisted, and alone." He stepped closer. Celine's spine hit the wall. She hadn't realized she'd been backing up. "So let me ask you again," the prince said softly. "Why do you keep making my life harder?" Celine's hands curled into fists. "Because someone has to. Those kids didn't ask for this war. They didn't ask to watch their families die. And now they're here, stuck in your palace, surrounded by people who look at them like they're furniture. If standing up for them makes your life harder, Your Highness, then I guess we're both going to have to live with that." The prince stared at her, really stared, like he was trying to see past her skin and bone to whatever kept her standing when common sense said to kneel. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met," he said finally, "or the stupidest. I haven't decided which. Does it matter?" "Yes, because brave people are useful. Stupid people get themselves killed." "And which one are you?" The words were out before Celine could stop them. The temperature in the room dropped. The prince's eyes went cold, that mask of absolute control slamming back into place. "I'm the one who won a war in 6 weeks by burning 17 villages to ash," he said quietly. "I'm the one who executed my own general for incompetence. I'm the one who keeps this kingdom running through fear because respect stopped working when my father died and the vultures started circling. So to answer your question, I'm whatever I need to be to survive." He turned toward the door. Celine's voice caught him before he could leave. "Is that why you saved Tam? Because it was strategically useful?" The prince paused, his hand on the door handle. He didn't turn around. "I saved Tam because that guard was a liability. Soldiers who can't control themselves in peacetime are worse than useless. They're dangerous. It wasn't about the boy, liar. The word hung in the air between them like a thrown knife. The prince turned slowly. His expression was dangerous. What did you just call me? Celine's heart was trying to break through her ribcage, but she'd already crossed the line. Might as well own it. You heard me. If it was just about the guard, you would have disciplined him privately. But you did it publicly, in front of everyone, because you wanted them to know that hurting those kids has consequences. You wanted them to be afraid of what you'd do if they stepped out of line. She took a shaky breath. That's not strategy, Your Highness. That's protection. The silence stretched so long, Celine thought he might actually kill her. Then the prince said very quietly, You don't know anything about me. I know you're lying to yourself if you think you don't care. The prince crossed the distance between them in 2 steps. Celine's back hit the wall again, and suddenly he was right there, close enough that she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled fury in his expression. You want to know what I care about? He said, his voice low and dangerous. I care about keeping this kingdom from tearing itself apart. I care about making sure the nobles don't start another civil war because they think I'm weak. I care about maintaining order in a world that runs on violence and fear. That's it. That's the list. His eyes bored into hers. Those children are alive because killing them would have been bad politics. You have a job because firing you would make me look petty. Everything I do is calculated. Everything. So don't stand here and tell me I'm protecting anyone. I'm managing resources. That's all. Celine held his gaze. Her hands were shaking, but her voice came out steady. If that's true, then why are you here? In my room, alone, at midnight, explaining yourself to someone you claim doesn't matter. The prince went absolutely still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Celine could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic in her ears. The prince's jaw tightened. Something flickered across his face. Anger, confusion, something else she couldn't name. Then he stepped back, putting distance between them like he'd just realized how close they'd been standing. This conversation is over, he said. His voice had gone flat, controlled. Stay out of politics, keep the children quiet, and stop making me defend you in public. We clear? Celine nodded. She didn't trust her voice. The prince left without another word. Celine stood there for a full 5 minutes after he was gone, her back against the wall, trying to remember how to breathe normally. Something had just shifted. She didn't know what exactly, but she could feel it, the weight of it, the danger of it. The prince wasn't just a tyrant maintaining power. He was a man who'd convinced himself that caring about anything was weakness, and he was terrified of what would happen if that armor cracked. The next week passed in tense silence. Celine threw herself into her work with the children. She got approval for a small outdoor area where they could get sunlight without being gawked at by nobles. She found a retired tutor willing to teach basic reading and arithmetic. She organized meal schedules, sleeping rotations, and a system where the older kids helped care for the younger ones. Slowly, the East Wing stopped feeling like a storage facility and started feeling like a home. The children noticed. They smiled more, fought less. Some of them even started calling her by name instead of just Miss or Ma'am. Tam, the boy who'd been caught stealing from the kitchens, attached himself to her like a shadow. He was small for 10, all sharp angles and watchful eyes. He barely talked, but he followed her everywhere, helping with whatever task she was doing. One afternoon, while they were folding clean linens together, he said quietly, "Why do you stay here?" Celine glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "Everyone hates you. The guards, the nobles, even some of the staff. I heard them talking. They say you're trouble, that the prince is going to get rid of you soon." Celine folded a sheet carefully, buying time to figure out how to answer. "I stay because you're here," she said finally. "You and the others. Somebody has to make sure you're safe. But you could leave. Go back to the lower districts. You said you had a sanctuary there." "I did, but it's not there anymore." Tam looked up sharply. "What happened?" Celine's hand stilled on the fabric. She'd been avoiding thinking about it, but the question forced it to the surface. The building was condemned 6 months ago. Structural damage, they said. But really it was because the landlord wanted to tear it down and build something more profitable. I fought it as long as I could, but I didn't have the money or the legal standing to win. She resumed folding, her movements mechanical. By the time the palace job offer came through, I had nowhere else to go anyway. So here I am. Tam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You lost everything too, just like us. Celine looked at him. Something in her chest went tight. Yeah, she said softly, just like you. Tam nodded once, processing. Then he went back to folding linens, and they worked in comfortable silence. Later that night, lying on her cot and staring at the ceiling, Celine realized something. She'd told the prince she was staying because the children needed her. But that wasn't the whole truth. She was staying because she needed them too. Because caring for them gave her a purpose bigger than survival. Because protecting them meant she wasn't just another broken person trying to outlast the world. Because if she could keep them safe, maybe she could prove that not everything good got destroyed. The storm broke 4 days later. Celine was in the East Wing common area, helping a group of younger kids with a puzzle, when Chancellor Veyron appeared in the doorway looking like death had personally requested a meeting. Miss Vale, my office. Now. The fear in his voice made Celine's stomach drop. She got one of the older girls to watch the group, then followed Veyron through the palace corridors at near jogging speed. What happened? She asked. Veyron didn't answer until they were inside his office with the door closed. There's been an incident. One of the children, a girl named Mira, was found in the West Wing guest quarters. In Lord Corvin's rooms, Celine's blood went cold. Is she okay? Physically, yes, but Lord Corvin is claiming she attempted to steal jewelry from his chambers. He's demanding punishment. Did she? Veyron rubbed his face. I don't know. She won't speak. Just keeps shaking. But Miss Vale, it doesn't matter. Corvin has witnesses, his personal guards, and he's pushing for a public trial. Celine's hands clenched. Where is she now? The guardhouse. Corvin insisted she be detained immediately. She's 12 years old. She's an Omega accused of theft by a lord. The law is very clear. Then the law is broken. Veyron flinched. Miss Vale, please. I'm trying to help. But Corvin has the prince's ear on this. He's arguing that leniency would set a dangerous precedent. Celine stared at him. The prince agreed to this? The prince hasn't made a final decision. But Corvin is citing the incident with Tam last week, saying your influence has made the children believe they can take what they want without consequences. This isn't about theft. Celine's voice shook with fury. This is about Corvin trying to prove he can destroy an Omega child and get away with it. Veyron looked miserable. I know. But unless we can prove Mira's innocence or get the prince to overrule Corvin, there's nothing. Then I'll talk to the prince. Miss Vale, he won't see you. He's in council meetings all. Celine was already out the door. She found him in the war room, surrounded by maps and military advisors. The guards at the entrance tried to stop her. She pushed past them. The room went silent as she burst in. A dozen high-ranking officials stared at her like she'd just grown a second head. The prince, standing at the head of the table with a strategic marker in hand, looked up slowly. His expression was ice. Out, he said quietly. The advisors fled. The guards hesitated, then followed when the prince jerked his head toward the door. The heavy door closed. They were alone. The prince set down the marker with deliberate precision. You have 10 seconds to give me a reason why I shouldn't have you thrown out of this palace. Celine crossed the distance to the table. Lord Corvin has Mira locked up in the guardhouse. He's claiming she tried to steal from him. And it's a lie. Mira is terrified of her own shadow. She wouldn't go into a noble's chambers unless someone forced her. Do you have proof? Do you need it? The prince's expression didn't change. Yes, I do. Because without proof, it's her word against a lord's, and the law doesn't favor Omega children over nobility. Then change the law. The prince laughed. It was a cold, brittle sound. Change the law, just like that. You think ruling a kingdom is that simple? I think you're powerful enough to do whatever you want. You just choose not to. The prince's eyes flashed. You don't know anything about what I choose. Every decision I make has consequences. If I overrule Corvin without evidence, I undermine the entire noble court. If I show favoritism to one Omega child, every noble in 6 territories will test me to see how far they can push. So you're going to let him destroy her to maintain order. I'm going to follow the law, which is more than you seem capable of doing. Celine slammed her hands on the table. The maps jumped. She's 12 years old. She's already lost everything. And now you're going to let some corrupt lord use her as a political pawn because you're too afraid of looking weak? The prince moved around the table so fast Celine barely saw him coming. Suddenly he was right there, towering over her, his presence overwhelming. "I am not afraid," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm strategic. There's a difference. Then be strategic about this. Mira's innocent and Corvin knows it. He's testing you to see if you'll protect your own palace residents or fold to noble pressure. If you cave now, every lord in the kingdom will know they can do whatever they want to those kids and you'll do nothing." She held his gaze, her heart hammering. "You want to maintain order? Then show them that order includes justice. Not just for nobles, for everyone." The prince stared at her. Something shifted in his expression, anger giving way to calculation, then to something she couldn't read. "Get out," he said finally. "Your Highness," I said, "get out. I'll handle this." "How? That's not your concern." "Like hell it's not. Mira trusts me. If something happens to her because I couldn't protect her..." The prince grabbed her arm. Not hard, but firm enough to stop her mid-sentence. His eyes bored into hers. "I said I'll handle it. That means you step back and let me do my job. Understand?" Celine wanted to argue, wanted to fight, but something in his expression stopped her. It wasn't cold anymore. It was focused, determined. He was actually going to do something. She pulled her arm free. "Fine, but if you sell her out to save face with Corvin, Corvin, I'll never forgive you." "I don't need your forgiveness," the prince said. "I need you to stay out of my way." He walked past her toward the door, then paused. "And Miss Vale? Next time you burst into a military strategy session, I won't be this generous." He left. Celine stood there, shaking with adrenaline and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Two hours later, the prince summoned Lord Corvin to the throne room. Celine heard about it from the palace staff, who were buzzing with speculation. She wanted to be there, to see what happened, but she'd been banned from court proceedings after her last outburst. So she waited in the East Wing, pacing like a caged animal, while Tam and the other kids watched nervously. Finally, Chancellor Veyron appeared. His expression was stunned. "Miss Vale, Mira's been released. The charges are dropped." Celine's knees nearly gave out. "What happened?" The prince invoked his right to examine the evidence personally. He questioned Corvin's guards separately. Their stories didn't match. Then he had the palace steward check the inventory of Corvin's chambers. Turns out nothing was actually missing. Celine's breath came out in a rush. So Corvin lied, publicly, in front of the entire court. The prince declared the accusation false and fined Corvin 3,000 marks for false testimony and abuse of authority. 3,000 marks. That was more than most families in the lower districts saw in a year. Where's Mira now? Being brought back here. She's shaken but unharmed. And Corvin? Veyron's expression went complicated, furious, but powerless. The prince made it very clear that any retaliation against Mira, you, or any of the children would result in permanent exile from court. Celine sat down hard on the nearest chair. The prince had actually done it, had stood up to one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, had protected Mira, had protected her. Why? Veyron asked quietly. Why does he care so much about these children? About you? Celine shook her head. I don't know, but that was a lie. She was starting to understand. The prince cared because he'd spent so long not caring about anything that when something finally broke through that armor, he didn't know how to handle it. So he did what he always did. He weaponized it, turned it into strategy, convinced himself it was all calculated. But it wasn't, and that terrified him. Tja! Mira returned an hour later, pale and quiet. Celine held her while she cried, whispering reassurances until the girl finally fell asleep on one of the common room couches. The other children gathered around, relief written on their faces. Tam sat beside Celine, his small hand gripping her sleeve. You saved her, he said quietly. Celine shook her head. I didn't. The prince did. Because you made him. Celine looked down at him. His dark eyes were too old for his face, full of understanding that no 10-year-old should have. Maybe, she said softly, but he still had to choose to do it. She stayed with the children until they'd all settled down for the night, then slipped out into the corridor. The palace was quiet. Most of the staff had retired. Only the night guards remained, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Celine found herself walking toward the war room without really deciding to. She shouldn't. It was late. The prince was probably busy or sleeping or doing whatever ruthless alpha heirs did when they weren't publicly humiliating corrupt nobles. But her feet kept moving. She found him on the western balcony overlooking the mountains, alone, staring out at the darkness. He didn't turn when she approached, but his shoulders tensed. "You should be with the children," he said. "They're asleep, and I needed to say thank you. I told you, I didn't do it for you." Celine stepped up beside him. The balcony was wide enough that they weren't touching, but she could feel the heat radiating off him, the tension in his frame. "Why did you do it then?" The prince was silent for a long time. Then he said, "When I was 12, my mother was accused of treason by the noble council. They said she was conspiring with enemy kingdoms, plotting to overthrow my father. The evidence was fabricated. Everyone knew it, but the council wanted her gone because she kept fighting their corruption." His hands tightened on the balcony railing. "My father could have stopped it. He was the king. He had absolute authority. But he was afraid of looking weak, of undermining the council's power. So he let them put her on trial." Celine's breath caught. She was executed 3 days later, poisoned in her cell before the verdict was even read. The council claimed it was suicide. My father knew better, but he did nothing. The prince turned to look at her finally. His eyes were empty. "I learned something that day. Power without the will to use it is worthless. My father had all the authority in the kingdom, and it meant nothing because he was too afraid to wield it." He looked back at the mountains. "I swore I'd never make that mistake, that when I had power, I'd use it. No hesitation, no weakness, no mercy." "That's not what you did today," Celine said quietly. "Today you showed mercy. Today I calculated that destroying Corvin's credibility was worth more than maintaining his alliance. Don't mistake strategy for compassion." But his voice had lost its edge. The words rang hollow. Celine took a breath. "Your mother. What was her name?" The prince's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because nobody said it yet. In your whole story. Like she was just a lesson instead of a person." The silence stretched long enough that Celine thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said very quietly, "Liana. Her name was Liana." Celine nodded. "Liana would have been proud of what you did today." The prince laughed bitterly. "My mother would have been horrified by what I've become. She believed in justice, mercy, protecting the weak. Everything I'm not. You saved Mira. That's protecting the weak. I destroyed Corvin because he was stupid enough to lie in front of witnesses. That's not heroism, it's politics." Celine turned to face him fully. "Why do you do this?" "Do what?" "Convince yourself that everything you do is calculated, that you don't care about anything. What are you so afraid of?" The prince went very still. When he looked at her, his eyes were dangerous. "I'm not afraid of anything." "Liar." The word hung between them like a challenge. The prince's expression shifted. Something dark and intense flickered across his face. "You keep calling me that," he said softly. "You should be more careful. One of these days I might decide to prove you wrong. Then prove it." The air between them went electric. The prince was staring at her like he couldn't decide whether to argue or throw her off the balcony. Then, in a move that surprised both of them, he closed the distance. He didn't touch her, just stood there, close enough that Celine could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched at his sides like he was physically stopping himself from reaching out. "You want to know what I'm afraid of?" he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm afraid that if I start caring about things, I'll make the same mistakes my father did. I'll hesitate. I'll be weak. And people I'm responsible for will die because I couldn't do what needed to be done." His eyes locked onto hers. "I'm afraid that you're right, that I do care, and that caring is going to destroy everything I've built." Celine's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own voice. "Maybe it'll destroy the wrong things," she said quietly. "Maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's growth." "Growth," the prince repeated. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've spent 10 years turning myself into something strong enough to survive this kingdom. And you walk in here with your impossible compassion and your stubborn refusal to break, and suddenly I'm questioning everything." He leaned in, just slightly, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. You're dangerous, Celine Vale. More dangerous than any enemy I've ever faced. Then maybe you should stop fighting me, Celine said. The prince stared at her. For one impossible moment, she thought he might actually kiss her. Then he stepped back abruptly, putting distance between them like he'd been burned. Get some sleep, Miss Vale. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. He turned and walked away, leaving Celine alone on the balcony with her racing heart and the sudden, terrifying realization that she was in far deeper than she'd ever intended to be. Oaks. The next morning, the palace was in chaos. Lord Corvin had stormed out at dawn, taking his entire household and half the Northern Trade Alliance with him. His departure triggered a cascade of political maneuvering as other nobles tried to figure out which side to take. The prince spent the entire day in emergency council sessions, managing the fallout. Celine spent the day with the children, trying to maintain normalcy while the palace descended into barely controlled panic around them. By evening, rumors were flying. Some said the prince had overstepped his authority. Others said Corvin had been planning a coup. A few whispered that the prince was growing soft, that the Omega woman from the slums had corrupted him. Celine heard it all. The staff weren't subtle. She was helping the younger kids prepare for bed when Tam pulled her aside. Something bad's gonna happen, he said quietly. I can feel it. Celine looked down at him. How do you know? Because that's what always happens when adults start fighting. The kids suffer. Celine knelt down to his level. I won't let that happen. I promise. But even as she said it, she felt the weight of the storm gathering. Bist. The attack came at midnight. Celine was already awake. She'd been sleeping badly for days when she heard the first screams. She bolted out of her room into the East Wing common area. Armed men, 6 of them, faces covered, moving through the sleeping children like wolves through a flock. Everything slowed down. Celine saw Tam frozen by his cot, saw Mira backing into a corner, saw the intruders reaching for them with rough hands. She didn't think, just moved. She grabbed a heavy iron candlestick from the nearest table and swung it at the closest intruder's head. He went down hard. The others turned on her. For a few desperate seconds, Celine held them off through sheer fury and the element of surprise. She got in 2 more solid hits before someone grabbed her from behind. Strong arms, alpha strength, she couldn't break free. One of the men advanced on Tam, and something inside Celine just broke. She'd spent her entire life being told that Omegas were weak, submissive, built to serve and obey. She'd learned to survive in a world that treated her existence as less than, that saw her compassion as exploitable and her defiance as unnatural. But in that moment, watching them reach for the children she'd sworn to protect, every instinct in her body aligned into one singular primal need. Protect them. The growl that tore out of her throat wasn't human. It was pure Omega fury, a sound that shouldn't have had power, that shouldn't have been able to stop anyone. But it did. The entire room froze. The growl reverberated through the stone walls, through the bodies of everyone present, carrying weight and authority that defied every rule about hierarchy and dominance. The intruders stumbled back. Even the one holding Celine loosened his grip, confusion and something like fear crossing his face. The children stared, eyes wide, and then the door burst open. The prince stood in the entrance, flanked by guards, his alpha presence flooding the room like a tidal wave. But he wasn't looking at the intruders. He was staring at Celine. His expression was shocked, raw, like he'd just seen something impossible. The intruders tried to run. The guards cut them off. Within seconds, all 6 were subdued and disarmed. The prince crossed the room slowly. His eyes never left Celine's face. Are you hurt? His voice came out rough. Celine shook her head. She was still shaking, adrenaline making her dizzy. The children? Safe, Celine managed. They're safe. The prince looked around at the frightened faces, then back at Celine. Something in his expression shifted, from shock to understanding to something deeper that she couldn't name. Get them secured, he said to the guards without turning around. I want to know who sent them and why. And someone get the physician up here to check every child. The guards moved. Within minutes, the room was swarming with palace staff. But the prince didn't move. He stood there, close enough that Celine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched like he was physically stopping himself from reaching for her. That growl, he said quietly, so only she could hear. Where did you learn to do that? Celine's breath was still coming too fast. I didn't learn it. It just happened. Omega growls don't work on alphas. They don't carry authority. They're defensive, not dominant. Celine met his eyes. I don't care what they're supposed to do. I care that it worked. The prince stared at her. Then, impossibly, he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. You're full of surprises, Celine Vale. Before she could respond, Chancellor Veyron burst into the room, looking harried. Your Highness, we've identified the intruders. They're carrying Corvin's house sigil. This was an assassination attempt. On who? The prince's voice went cold. Veyron hesitated, glancing at Celine. We're not sure yet, but given the target location and timing, it seems they were after either Miss Vale or the children, possibly both. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. The prince turned to look at the subdued intruders. When he spoke, his voice was soft. Lethal. Bring Corvin back here, in chains if necessary, and someone find out who else was involved in planning this. I want names, all of them. Your Highness, if we arrest a sitting lord without a full investigation, do I look like I'm asking for advice, Veyron? The Chancellor went pale. No, Your Highness. Then move. Veyron fled. The prince turned back to Celine. His eyes had gone dark. This is my fault, he said quietly. I humiliated Corvin publicly. He retaliated. And you almost paid the price. Celine's hands were still shaking, but her voice came out steady. This isn't on you. Corvin made his choice. You just exposed him for what he is. That doesn't change the fact that you're a target now. You and the children. Then protect us. The words hung in the air between them. The prince studied her face. Then he nodded once, decisive. Pack essentials for the children. You're all moving to the royal wing. My personal guard will be stationed outside at all times. Nobody gets close without my explicit permission. Your Highness, the nobles will see that as... I don't care what the nobles see. These children are under royal protection now. Anyone who touches them answers to me personally. He held Celine's gaze. That includes you. And for the first time since she'd met him, Celine saw something in the prince's eyes that looked almost like fear. Not fear of enemies or political consequences. Fear of what it meant that he cared. The royal wing smelled like old power and older secrets. Celine stood in the corridor outside the suite that would house the children, watching palace staff rush back and forth with bedding and supplies. The space was 3 times larger than the East Wing quarters, with actual windows that let in sunlight, thick carpets that muffled footsteps, and furniture that looked like it cost more than she'd earned in her entire life. The prince had kept his word. Within 2 hours of the attack, every child had been relocated under armed guard. Now soldiers stood at every entrance, their hands never far from their weapons. Tam appeared at her elbow, his small face tight with worry. This doesn't feel safer, he said quietly. It feels like a prettier cage. Celine looked down at him. Sometimes cages keep things out instead of keeping you in. But the boy's eyes were too knowing, too old. He'd learned the hard way that protection and imprisonment often wore the same face. The prince emerged from inside the suite, his expression unreadable. He spoke briefly to the captain of the guard, then turned to Celine. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. Celine followed him down a side corridor away from the bustle and chaos. The silence between them felt heavy, weighted with everything that had happened in the last 6 hours. They stopped at a window overlooking the training yard. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky the color of old bruises. Corvin's being held in the North Tower, the prince said, without looking at her. My interrogators are working on him now. By tonight, I'll know everyone involved in planning that attack. And then what? Then I make an example that ensures nobody ever tries something like this again. Celine studied his profile. The exhaustion was visible now, lines around his eyes, tension in his jaw, the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. You didn't sleep, she said. Neither did you. Fair point. The prince finally turned to face her. His eyes were storm dark, intense. That growl you released. I've been thinking about it all night. Omega dominance displays don't work like that. They're not supposed to carry that kind of authority. Maybe nobody told my body the rules. Or maybe something else is happening. His voice dropped. My mother could do something similar. When the court tried to intimidate her, she had this way of pushing back that shouldn't have been possible for an Omega. It wasn't submission. It was refusal. He paused, something complicated passing across his face. The nobles hated her for it, said she was unnatural, dangerous, that she was corrupting the natural order by not knowing her place. Celine's chest tightened. And your father? What did he think? The prince's expression went cold. He thought she was making his life difficult, that her refusal to play by their rules was causing political problems he didn't want to deal with, so he let them kill her. The words hung between them like an accusation and a confession all at once. The prince looked away. There's a lesson in that. Power doesn't mean anything if you're not willing to use it against the people closest to you. My father learned that too late. Is that why you push everyone away, so you never have to make that choice? The prince was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, I push people away because caring about them gives my enemies leverage. And in this kingdom, leverage gets you killed. He looked at her directly. Which is why you're a problem, Celine Vale. Because I'm starting to care, and I can't afford that. The vulnerability in his voice made something in Celine's chest crack open. She'd spent weeks thinking of him as untouchable, unreachable, a wall of ice that couldn't be melted. But he wasn't. He was just a man who'd been hurt so badly he'd turned himself into armor. Then don't, she said softly. Don't care. It'll be easier for both of us. Too late. The words were barely a whisper, but they hit like a physical blow. Before Celine could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Chancellor Veyron appeared, his face pale. Your Highness? We have a situation. The prince's mask slammed back into place. What kind? Veyron glanced at Celine, hesitating. Say it, the prince ordered. Whatever it is, she's going to find out anyway. The interrogation of Lord Corvin has revealed something unexpected. The attack last night wasn't just about retaliation. It was a diversion. A diversion for what? Veyron took a breath. A coup attempt. Corvin was working with a faction of nobles who believe you've become too unstable to rule. They're calling for your removal from the succession and the installation of your cousin, Lord Matthias, as acting regent. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. How many? The prince asked, his voice deadly calm. At least 8 major houses. Possibly more. They're meeting in secret to draft a formal petition to present to the High Council. Celine felt her stomach drop. She knew enough about politics to understand what that meant. If enough noble houses united against the prince, they could force a vote. And in a kingdom that ran on fear and alliances, once the cracks started showing, everything could collapse. Where's Matthias now? The prince asked. In the city. He claims he knew nothing about the coup, but his supporters have been gathering at his estate for the past 2 days. Convenient timing, Veyron nodded miserably. Your Highness, if we don't act quickly, this could spiral into civil war. The noble houses are already choosing sides. Some support you, but many are waiting to see which way the wind blows. The prince was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, Summon the High Council for an emergency session tomorrow night. Every noble house, every guild representative, every voice that matters. We're settling this publicly. Your Highness, that's incredibly risky. If the vote doesn't go your way, then I'll deal with the consequences. But I'm not going to let this fester in the shadows. If my nobles want to remove me, they're going to have to do it to my face. Veyron bowed and left, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. The prince turned to Celine. His eyes were hard again, all vulnerability buried deep. You should leave. Take the children and go. Tonight, while you still can. Celine stared at him. You want me to run? I want you alive. If this goes badly tomorrow, everyone associated with me becomes a target. The children included. If it goes badly, they'll need someone to protect them. I'm not running. You're being stupid. I'm being loyal. The prince stepped closer, his expression intense. Loyalty gets people killed in this world. Haven't you figured that out yet? Celine held her ground. Maybe. But abandoning people when they need you turns you into exactly what your father was. The hit landed. She saw it in the way the prince flinched, in the flash of pain across his face before the mask came back. Get some rest, he said coldly. Tomorrow's going to be brutal. He walked away without looking back. The next 30 hours passed in a haze of preparation and dread. Celine kept the children occupied, but she could feel the tension radiating through the palace like heat from a forge. Guards moved with hands on weapons. Staff whispered in corners. The air itself felt fragile. like one wrong word could shatter everything. Tam stayed close to her, his silence more eloquent than questions. That evening, as Celine was putting the younger children to bed, Chancellor Veyron appeared at the door again. "The prince requests your presence at the council session tonight." Celine looked up sharply. "Why?" "I don't know." But it wasn't a suggestion. She got one of the older girls to watch the children, then followed Veyron through corridors that seemed darker than usual, more oppressive. The council chamber was massive, circular, with tiered seating rising toward a domed ceiling painted with scenes of conquest and glory. Every seat was filled. Nobles in silk and jewels, guildmasters in merchant finery, military commanders in dress uniforms. They all went silent when Celine entered. The prince sat at the head of the chamber on a raised platform, his throne backlit by torches. He looked like something carved from marble and malice. His eyes found Celine immediately. He gestured to a seat near the front, separate from the General Assembly. Celine sat, feeling every stare like a knife between her shoulder blades. Lord Matthias stood near the center of the chamber. He was older than the prince, maybe 40, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that calculated constantly. He looked at Celine with open contempt. The High Chancellor, an ancient man who looked like he'd personally witnessed the kingdom's founding, called the session to order. "We are gathered to address a petition from 8 noble houses requesting the removal of Prince Kael Draven from the line of succession due to conduct unbecoming of the crown." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The prince's expression didn't change. "The charges," the High Chancellor continued, "are as follows. Excessive use of force against nobility, favoritism toward lower classes, emotional instability, and the elevation of an Omega commoner to a position of inappropriate influence within the palace." Every word felt designed to cut. The High Chancellor looked at the prince. "How do you answer these charges?" The prince stood slowly. His presence filled the chamber. "The charge of excessive force refers to my punishment of Lord Corvin for falsely accusing a child of theft and orchestrating an assassination attempt on palace residents. If defending children from corrupt nobles is grounds for removal, then your standards need examination." Some nobles shifted uncomfortably. Others looked unmoved. "The favoritism charge stems from my decision to provide care for war orphans rather than send them to workhouses. If basic humanity is now politically inconvenient, I invite any of you to explain that position publicly." He paused, his eyes sweeping the chamber. "As for emotional instability, I've prosecuted a successful war, maintained order in 6 territories, and managed this kingdom's economy through 2 trade crises. My decisions have been strategic and necessary. If you disagree, present evidence, not speculation." Lord Matthias stepped forward. "And the Omega? What about her?" The prince's gaze locked onto his cousin. "What about her? You've given her unprecedented access to the royal wing. You've defended her publicly multiple times. You've allowed her to influence policy regarding the orphans." Matthias's voice dripped contempt. "She's a commoner from the slums with no training, no breeding, no right to be anywhere near the throne. She's an employee doing her job. Nothing more." The words hit Celine like a slap. She kept her face neutral, but something inside her chest twisted. "An employee who growled at palace guards," Matthias pressed. "An employee who defied court protocol. An employee who somehow convinced you to humiliate one of the kingdom's oldest noble houses. That's not professional conduct, cousin. That's manipulation." He turned to address the chamber. "Prince Kael has allowed this woman to corrupt his judgment. He's making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. And that makes him dangerous, not just to the nobility, but to the entire kingdom." Applause broke out from several sections. Other nobles remained silent, watching. The prince descended from his platform. His movements were predatory, controlled. "You want to talk about manipulation, Matthias? Let's talk about how you've been meeting with Corvin's allies for months. How you've been positioning yourself as an alternative ruler. How this entire petition conveniently serves your ambition." Matthias's expression didn't flicker. "I'm protecting this kingdom from a ruler who's lost his objectivity." "No, you're attempting a coup because you think I'm vulnerable." The chamber erupted in shouts and accusations. The High Chancellor banged his staff for order. "Enough! We will vote! All in favor of removing Prince Kael from succession and installing Lord Matthias as acting regent?" Hands rose throughout the chamber. Celine counted frantically. Too many, far too many. All opposed? More hands, but not enough. The High Chancellor's face was grim. The vote is 32 in favor, 28 opposed. The motion, a voice cut through the chamber like thunder. I invoke right of challenge. Every head turned. The prince stood at the center of the floor, his expression cold and absolute. The High Chancellor went pale. Your Highness, right of challenge hasn't been invoked in 3 generations. It's archaic, dangerous. It's also legal. And it's my right as the challenged party. Matthias's expression shifted from triumph to calculation. You want to settle this through trial by combat? I want to settle this the old way, the way our ancestors did when words failed and votes meant nothing. You claim I'm unfit to rule? Prove it. Face me yourself. The chamber went absolutely silent. Trial by combat was ancient law. 2 claimants settling succession through personal battle. It was brutal, final, and legally binding. Winner took everything. Loser usually died. Matthias smiled slowly. You're that desperate? I'm that confident. Accept or withdraw your petition. Those are your options. Celine's hands gripped the edge of her seat. This was insane. The prince was gambling everything on a single fight. Matthias looked around the chamber, gauging the mood. The nobles were leaning forward, hungry for violence disguised as honor. I accept, Matthias said. Tomorrow, at dawn. The old arena. Weapons of choice. The prince nodded once. Done. The High Chancellor looked like he wanted to object, but knew it was pointless. The vote is suspended pending the outcome of trial by combat. May the ancestors guide the righteous. The session ended in chaos. Nobles rushed to place bets, form alliances, position themselves for either outcome. Celine sat frozen as the chamber emptied around her. The prince approached slowly. His expression was unreadable. You think I'm insane, he said quietly. Celine looked up at him. I think you just bet your entire kingdom on whether you can kill your cousin before he kills you. That's accurate. Why? Why not fight this politically? You still had support in that chamber. Political fights drag on for months. People die in the shadows. Children get used as pawns. This way, it ends tomorrow. Clean, final. Or you die and Matthias becomes king. The prince's jaw tightened. Then you take the children and run as far as you can, because he won't show them the mercy I have. Celine stood, anger rising. Don't talk like you've already lost. I'm being realistic. Matthias is good, better than most people know, and I haven't slept in 48 hours. Then go sleep. You've got maybe 12 hours before you have to fight for your life. The prince looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression cracked. I need you to promise me something, he said quietly. What? If I lose tomorrow, don't try to stay. Don't try to negotiate. Don't think you can reason with Matthias or the nobles. Just take the children and disappear. Celine's throat tightened. And if you win, then we'll figure out what happens next. Together. The word hung between them, weighted with everything neither of them had said. Before Celine could respond, the prince turned and walked away, his shoulders carrying the weight of a kingdom that might not be his by sunset. Celine didn't sleep. She spent the night with the children, making sure they were settled, that the older ones understood they might need to leave quickly tomorrow. Tam watched her pack emergency supplies with knowing eyes. We're going to run again, aren't we? He said quietly. Maybe. I don't know yet. Because the prince might die. Celine's hands stilled. Yeah, because of that. Tam was quiet for a moment. He's a good person. Under all the scary parts, I can tell. Celine looked at him. How? Because he reminds me of you. Pretending not to care because caring hurts too much. The observation was so accurate, it hurt. Just before dawn, Celine left the children under guard and made her way to the old arena. It was a relic from the kingdom's brutal early days. A circular stone pit surrounded by tiered seating carved directly into the mountain. No roof, no shelter, just raw stone and sky. The stands were already packed. Every noble, every courtier, every person with enough status to claim a seat had shown up to watch. Celine found a spot near the edge, away from the crowds. The prince entered from the north gate, wearing simple leather armor and carrying a long sword. No crown, no ceremony, just a man preparing to fight for everything he had. Matthias entered from the south, similarly dressed, his weapon a shorter blade with a vicious curve. The High Chancellor stood at the arena's edge, his voice magically amplified to carry. By ancient law and sacred tradition, this challenge will be settled through trial by combat. The victor claims the throne and the loyalty of all houses. The defeated forfeits all claims to rule. He paused. This is a fight to submission, incapacitation, or death. There will be no intervention. May your cause be just. He lowered his staff. The fighters circled each other, moving like predators. Then Matthias attacked. The fight was brutal from the first clash. Matthias fought like someone who'd been training for this moment his entire life. Fast, precise, targeting weaknesses with surgical accuracy. The prince fought like someone who'd learned combat through necessity rather than sport. Rougher, more desperate, but effective. Blood appeared within the first minute. The prince's shoulder, a shallow cut, but it was bleeding. The crowd roared. Celine's hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. The fight dragged on. Minutes that felt like hours. Both men were breathing hard now, sweat and blood mixing. Then Matthias got inside the prince's guard and drove his blade toward the heart. The prince twisted at the last second. The blade scored his ribs instead of puncturing his chest. He dropped to one knee. The crowd went wild. Matthias raised his sword for the killing blow, and Celine felt something break inside her. She didn't plan it, didn't think about consequences or protocol or the fact that intervention was forbidden. She just released every ounce of fury and desperation and refusal that had been building inside her since the moment she'd walked into this God's damned palace. The growl that tore out of her wasn't omega submission or alpha dominance. It was pure survival, pure rage, pure love disguised as defiance. The sound hit the arena like a physical shockwave. Matthias stumbled. His swing went wide. The prince looked up, his eyes finding Celine across the distance. And something in his expression changed. He surged to his feet, moving faster than should have been possible with his injuries. His sword came up in a devastating arc that caught Matthias completely off guard. The blade drove through Matthias's defenses and into his side. Not fatal, but decisive. Matthias collapsed, blood spreading across the stones. The prince stood over him, sword at his throat. "Yield," he said quietly. Matthias coughed blood. His eyes were full of hatred. "This isn't over. Yes, it is. Yield or die. Choose." Silence stretched across the arena. Then Matthias spoke, his voice carrying despite the blood in his lungs. "I yield." The crowd exploded. The High Chancellor raised his staff. "Prince Cael Draven is victorious. By law and tradition, all challenges are dismissed. Long live the prince." The chant took up across the arena. Long live the prince. But the prince wasn't looking at his nobles or his kingdom or his victory. He was looking at Celine. And his expression was complicated. Gratitude and anger and something deeper all mixed together. He walked toward her, limping from his wounds, leaving a trail of blood across the stone. The crowd parted like water. He stopped in front of her. "You interfered," he said quietly. "I saved your life. You broke sacred law. The nobles saw it. They'll use it against you, against us. Let them." The prince stared at her. Then, impossibly, he smiled. It was small and exhausted and more genuine than anything she'd seen on his face. "You're going to be the death of me, Celine Vale. Not today, I'm not." He reached out, his bloody hand finding hers. The crowd was watching. The nobles were calculating. But for one moment, neither of them cared. Then the prince's eyes shifted, focusing on something past Celine's shoulder. His expression went from exhausted relief to shock, to horror. Celine turned. Chancellor Veyron stood at the arena entrance, flanked by a dozen armed soldiers. But they weren't palace guards. They wore the colors of the southern territories, enemy colors. And Veyron was smiling. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," he called out, "but this kingdom needs stability, and you've proven you can't provide it." He gestured. The soldiers moved forward, weapons drawn. The palace guards moved to intercept and then stopped, lowering their weapons, because half of them wore the southern colors too. Celine felt the world tilt. The prince's hand tightened on hers. His voice came out raw, broken in a way she'd never heard. "Veyron, you've been with me for 10 years, and I've watched you destroy everything your father built." The chancellor's voice was cold. "This kingdom needs a leader who understands that power comes from alliances, not intimidation. That mercy is weakness. That caring about orphans and Omega commoners is a luxury we can't afford. He gestured again. More soldiers appeared, surrounding the arena. You're under arrest for crimes against the kingdom. You and your Omega will stand trial for conspiracy and treason. The prince laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. You planned this. The coup, Matthias, all of it. You've been setting me up for months. Years, Veyron corrected. Since the moment you started showing weakness, since you began caring about things more than strategy. His eyes shifted to Celine. Since she arrived and corrupted what little judgment you had left. The prince stepped in front of Celine, his body a shield despite his wounds. Touch her, and I'll kill every single one of you. You're in no condition to kill anyone, Your Highness? Veyron's smile was poisonous. Soldiers, take them both. The soldiers advanced. The prince raised his sword, blood dripping from his side, and Celine realized with crystal clarity that they were out of options, that the man she'd started to care about was about to die defending her, that everything they'd fought for was about to crumble, unless she did something unforgivable. Celine stepped out from behind the prince. Wait, she called out. Her voice carried across the arena. I'll come quietly. No resistance. Just leave him alive. The prince grabbed her arm. What are you doing? Saving your life, again. Celine. She looked at him, really looked at him, memorizing every detail. The storm-colored eyes, the exhaustion, the desperation. You told me once that caring was weakness, she said quietly. You were wrong. Caring is the only thing that's kept either of us human. She pulled free of his grip. I'm the one you want, she called to Veyron. The corrupting influence. Take me and let him go. The chancellor considered. Then he nodded. Acceptable. The prince is more useful alive anyway. Easier to control when he's broken. No, the prince said. His voice was raw. No, I won't let you. Soldiers grabbed him before he could move. He fought like a wounded animal, but there were too many, and he was losing blood too fast. Celine, he shouted. Don't do this! Don't you dare! I'm sorry, she said. For everything. The soldiers hauled her away. The last thing she saw before they dragged her out of the arena was the prince on his knees, held down by 6 men, screaming her name. And she realized that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to sacrifice everything you've become, even if it destroys you both. The dungeon cells beneath Moonfang Palace smelled like despair and old blood. Celine woke to darkness, so complete she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. Her head throbbed where they'd hit her during the arrest. Her wrists were raw from chains that bit into skin every time she moved. She didn't know how long she'd been down here. Hours. Maybe days. Time lost meaning when you couldn't see the sun, but she could still hear the prince's voice in her head, screaming her name as they dragged her away. The raw desperation in it, the fury, the pain. She'd broken him. Not the nobles, not Veyron's betrayal, not even losing the throne. She'd broken him by choosing to sacrifice herself, by proving that caring about someone could be weaponized, could be used to destroy you from the inside out. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent weeks telling him that caring wasn't weakness, and then she'd proven him right by getting herself captured the moment she cared too much to watch him die. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Torchlight flickered through the bars. Chancellor Veyron appeared, flanked by 2 guards. He looked exactly the same as always, calm, composed, utterly in control. Like betraying a prince he'd served for 10 years was just another administrative task. Miss Vale, I trust your accommodations are adequate. Celine didn't waste energy on sarcasm. Where are the children? Safe. For now. Veyron stepped closer to the bars. Their fate depends entirely on your cooperation. Celine's blood went cold. You said you'd leave the prince alone if I came quietly, and I have. He's alive, recovering from his wounds in his quarters, under guard. I keep my word, Miss Vale, when it serves my purposes. What do you want? Tomorrow morning, you're going to stand trial for corrupting the prince and conspiring to undermine the kingdom's stability. You're going to confess publicly to manipulating him, to using your influence to turn him against the nobility, to being a foreign agent sent to destabilize Moonfang from within. Celine laughed. It came out harsh and bitter. Nobody's going to believe that. They will when I'm done presenting evidence. Forged letters, testimony from paid witnesses, circumstantial patterns that paint a very convincing picture. By the time I'm finished, you'll be remembered as the Omega spy who nearly destroyed a kingdom. And if I refuse, then the children die. One by one, starting with the smallest. Celine's vision went red. Her hands clenched into fists despite the chains. You're a monster. No, Miss Vale. I'm a pragmatist. The prince was destroying everything his father built because he couldn't separate emotion from duty. You made it worse by encouraging his weakness. I'm simply removing the cancer before it kills the patient. He gestured to the guards. Think about my offer. You have until dawn. Confess and spare the children. Refuse and watch them suffer for your pride. He turned to leave. Why? Celine called after him. Why betray him now? After 10 years? Varen paused. Because 10 years ago, I thought I could shape him into a proper ruler. I thought his cruelty was strength, that his coldness was control. But then you arrived and showed him there was another way, and I realized he was never going to be what this kingdom needs. So I found someone who would. Matthias? Matthias was a useful distraction. The real power will be the southern territories once they annex Moonfang through a peaceful transition. They've been waiting for an opening. I've given them one. You sold out your entire kingdom. I saved it from a weak ruler who couldn't make the hard choices. History will thank me. He walked away, leaving Celine alone in the darkness with her chains and her fury and the terrible knowledge that she'd played right into his hands. 3 levels above, in his private quarters, Prince Kael Draven sat at the edge of his bed and tried not to think about the fact that he was bleeding again. The healers had stitched his ribs and bandaged his shoulder, but the wounds kept reopening every time he moved. Didn't matter. He'd bled before. He'd bleed again. Pain was just information telling you that you were still alive. What he couldn't deal with was the hollow feeling in his chest where his control used to be. 10 years. 10 years of building walls, of turning himself into something cold enough to survive, of convincing himself that caring was suicide by another name. And one Omega woman with impossible courage had walked in and demolished everything in a matter of weeks. He'd let himself care, had let himself hope, had started believing that maybe ruling through fear wasn't the only option, that maybe there was another way. And look where it got him. Celine was in the dungeons. The children were under guard by soldiers he couldn't trust. His own chancellor, the man who'd stood beside him through wars and executions and every brutal decision required to maintain power, had betrayed him. And he was trapped in his own quarters, surrounded by guards who were loyal to Veyron now, with orders to keep the prince contained until the trial tomorrow. They hadn't taken his throne yet. That would require a formal succession process, but they'd effectively neutered him, turned him into a figurehead waiting for the axe to fall. Kael stood slowly, ignoring the way his ribs screamed in protest. He walked to the window overlooking the training yard. Dawn was maybe 4 hours away. 4 hours before Celine stood trial for crimes she didn't commit. 4 hours before Veyron solidified his coup. 4 hours to figure out how to destroy everything standing between him and the only person who'd ever made him want to be something other than a weapon. The door opened without a knock. Captain Henrik entered, the same man who'd commanded the palace guard for 6 years. His face was grim. Your Highness? I thought you should know. Half the guard has defected to Veyron's side. The other half is confused and leaderless. If you try anything, they'll cut you down before you make it to the stairs. Kael turned slowly. So you're here to tell me I'm powerless. How generous. Henrik's expression didn't change. I'm here to tell you that 16 of us still remember our oaths. To the crown. Not to whoever's currently holding the knife to the crown's throat. Kael felt something shift in his chest. 16 soldiers against an entire garrison and Southern Territory reinforcements. Suicide odds. Perfect. What do you need? Kael asked. Henrik stepped closer, lowering his voice. A plan that doesn't get everyone killed. Veyron's got the dungeons locked down, the children under heavy guard, and enough soldiers loyal to him that a frontal assault would be a massacre. Then we don't go frontal. Kael's mind was already working, pieces falling into place the way they used to during the war. We go surgical. Small team, specific targets, maximum chaos. Henrik waited. Kael looked out the window again, calculating. The trial's set for dawn in the main courtyard. Public execution afterward if Celine doesn't confess. Veyron wants it visible, wants everyone to see what happens to people who corrupt the prince. So we hit them during the trial, when everyone's focused on the spectacle. No, we hit them before, while they're still moving pieces into position. He turned back to Henrik, and for the first time in days, his expression was sharp, predatory. Veyron thinks I'm broken, thinks taking Celine neutralized me. He's wrong. It just gave me clarity about what I'm willing to sacrifice to get her back. Henrik studied his face. What do you need from us? Access to the old tunnels under the palace, the ones my mother used when the nobles tried to poison her. Henrik's eyes widened slightly. Those tunnels were sealed after she died. My father sealed them. I know where the keys are hidden. Get me there and I'll handle the rest. And if Veyron's anticipated this, then a lot of people are going to die, possibly including me. But at least I'll die doing something other than sitting in this room waiting for permission to save the person who matters. Henrik nodded once. Give me 30 minutes to gather the others. He left. Kale stood there for a moment, letting the decision settle into his bones. He'd spent 10 years being the prince everyone feared, the calculating ruler, the cold strategist, the man who chose power over everything else. Time to find out what he was when he stopped choosing power and started choosing the people who made power worth having. A case. The tunnels beneath the palace were exactly as Kyle remembered, narrow, dark, smelling like centuries of secrets. His mother had shown them to him when he was 8 years old, making him memorize every turn in case he ever needed to run. He'd never thought he'd need them to fight. Instead, Henrik and 15 soldiers followed in silence. They'd stripped off their palace uniforms, wearing dark clothes that wouldn't reflect torchlight, half-carried crossbows. The rest had short blades designed for close quarters. Kale led them through passages that hadn't seen use in 14 years. His ribs protested every step, but he ignored the pain. Pain was just noise. Focus was everything. They emerged in the lower dungeons, a section that predated the current prison system. Ancient cells carved directly into the mountain, forgotten by everyone except the royal family. Kale moved through the darkness like he'd been born to it. He'd spent years learning every inch of this palace, every hidden route, every weakness. Knowledge was just another weapon, and he'd always been good at collecting weapons. They found the junction point, a place where the old tunnels connected to the new prison through a maintenance corridor. 2 guards stood watch, bored and unprepared. Henrik's crossbowmen dropped them before they could shout. The bodies hit the ground with soft thuds. Kyle stepped over them without looking down. They moved faster now, urgency building. Every second brought them closer to dawn, closer to the moment when Veyron would realize the prince wasn't in his quarters anymore. Kale found Celine's cell through a combination of memory and instinct. The dungeon layout hadn't changed since his grandfather's time. High-value prisoners always went in the same section, far enough from the main entrance to discourage rescue, close enough to the torture chambers to encourage cooperation. 2 more guards. Henrik's men handled them. Kale grabbed the keys from the dead guard's belt and unlocked the cell door. Celine was chained to the far wall, her head down, exhaustion in every line of her body. She looked up when the door opened, and her eyes went wide. Kyle. His name and her voice did something to his chest that felt dangerously close to breaking. He crossed the cell in 3 steps and started working on her chains. His hands were shaking. He forced them steady. How bad are you hurt? I'm fine. Celine's voice came out hoarse. But the children are next. But I needed to get you first. The chains came free. Celine rubbed her wrists, wincing. Kyle caught her hands, examining the raw skin. When I find Veyron, he said quietly, I'm going to make him understand what happens when someone takes things that belong to me. Celine looked up at him. Her eyes were fierce despite the exhaustion. I don't belong to anyone. Kale's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. Fine. When I find Veyron, I'm going to make him understand what happens when someone hurts the person I... He stopped. The words caught in his throat. The person you what? Celine asked softly. Kale looked at her, really looked at her. The dirt on her face, the defiance still burning in her eyes, the courage that had nearly gotten her killed multiple times. The person I can't lose, he said finally, even if admitting that makes me weak. Celine's expression cracked. Then I guess we're both weak. Good. We can be weak together after we survive the next hour. He pulled her to her feet. Henrik was waiting at the cell entrance. Your Highness, we need to move. Veyron's people will have noticed the missing guards by now. They ran. The tunnels became a maze of desperate flight and controlled violence. They encountered 3 more patrol groups. Each time, Henrik's soldiers fought with brutal efficiency, while Kyle and Celine kept moving. They emerged in the eastern wing near the children's quarters. The hallway was empty. Too empty. Kyle's instinct screamed trap. Hold, he ordered. Henrik raised a fist. His soldiers froze. Kale studied the corridor. The guards who should have been stationed at the children's door were gone. The torches were burning, but the shadows were wrong. Then he saw it. A thin wire stretched across the corridor at ankle height, connected to something in the wall, probably an alarm. Maybe worse. Back, he said quietly. There's another way. They retreated into the tunnels and circled around, coming up through a servant's passage that opened into a storage room adjacent to the children's quarters. Kyle picked the lock, another skill his mother had insisted he learn, and they slipped inside. The children were huddled in the main room, guarded by 6 soldiers wearing Southern Territory colors. Not palace guards. Veyron's reinforcements. One of the soldiers had his hand on Tam's shoulder. The boy's face was white with terror. Kale's vision went red. He'd killed men before. In war. In self-defense. In cold political necessity. But he'd never felt the kind of murderous rage that flooded through him now, seeing that soldier's hand on a frightened child. Henrik caught his arm. Your Highness, if we go in hard, they'll use the children as shields. Then we go quiet. How? There's 6 of them in an open room. Kale's mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles and risks. Then his eyes found Celine's. She nodded once. She understood. This is going to be risky, Kale said. Everything about this situation is risky. Celine's voice was steady. What do you need me to do? Distraction. Walk in there, get their attention on you. The second they're focused forward, we come through the side entrance. That's a terrible plan. It's the only plan. And we're out of time. Celine took a breath. Then she squared her shoulders and walked toward the main door. Kale's heart tried to punch through his ribcage. Every instinct screamed at him to stop her, to find another way that didn't involve using her as bait. But he'd learned something in the last few weeks. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was trust someone else to be strong. Celine opened the door and stepped into the children's room. All 6 soldiers spun toward her, weapons raised. Now, Kyle said. Henrik's team burst through the side entrance. Crossbow bolts flew. 3 soldiers dropped instantly. The remaining 3 tried to fight back. One grabbed Tam as a shield. Kyle didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 2 seconds flat, ignoring his screaming ribs, and drove his blade through the soldier's exposed side. The man dropped. Tam scrambled away, crying. The last 2 soldiers surrendered, hands raised, terror written across their faces. Secure them, Kyle ordered Henrik. Then get the children ready to move. He turned to Celine. She was kneeling beside Mira, checking the girl for injuries. Everyone okay? Scared, confused, but alive. Kale looked around at 73 frightened faces staring at him. These children had been through hell, lost their families, survived a war, endured weeks of uncertainty and fear, and now they were caught in another battle they didn't ask for. He knelt down, putting himself at their level. Listen to me, he said, his voice rough but clear. I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt, but I promise you right here, right now, nobody else is taking you. Nobody else is using you. You're under my protection, and I don't break my promises. A small girl with braids spoke up. Are we going to have to run again? Maybe. But this time you won't be running alone. I'll be right beside you. Tam stepped forward. What about Miss Celine? Kyle looked at Celine. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Miss Celine stays with us, Kyle said. Always. The word hung in the air like a vow. Henrik appeared in the doorway. Your Highness, Veyron knows we're here. He's got soldiers converging on this position. We've got maybe 5 minutes. Then we move now. Kyle stood. Henrik, split your team. Half escorts the children through the tunnels to the northern safe house. The other half comes with me. Where are you going? To end this, Veyron wants a public trial at dawn. He's going to get one, just not the one he planned. Your Highness, you're not thinking clearly. You're wounded, outnumbered. I'm done running. I'm done hiding. I'm done letting other people decide what happens to the people I care about. He looked at Celine. Get the children to safety. Take Henrik's escort. I'll handle Veyron. Celine stepped forward. Absolutely not. You're not doing this alone. I'm not asking permission. And I'm not giving you a choice. Celine's voice was steel. You want to end this? Fine. But you don't get to sacrifice yourself while telling me sacrifice is stupid. We do this together or not at all. Kale wanted to argue, wanted to lock her somewhere safe where Veyron couldn't touch her. But he looked into her eyes and saw the same impossible courage that had first caught his attention, the same refusal to break that had slowly dismantled every wall he'd built. She wasn't going to back down. And he was done trying to make her. Fine, he said, together. But if this goes wrong, it won't. How can you be so sure? Because we're not fighting for power anymore. We're fighting for something that actually matters. She was right. That's what made her dangerous. That's what made her necessary. Kael turned to Henrik. Get the children out. Use the northern tunnel. There's a safe house 3 miles from the palace. An old hunting lodge my mother kept stocked for emergencies. Take them there and wait for word. And if the word never comes, then you keep them safe and find someone better than me to rule this kingdom. Henrik saluted once, then started organizing the evacuation. The children filed past, some crying, some silent, all scared. Tam paused beside Kael. You're gonna win, right? The boy's voice was small. Kael looked down at him. I'm gonna try. That's not the same thing. No, but it's the best I've got. Tam nodded, then followed the others into the tunnel. Within 3 minutes, the children were gone. Only Kael, Celine, and 8 of Henrik's soldiers remained. Kael moved to the window overlooking the main courtyard. The trial platform was already constructed, a raised stage with posts for binding prisoners, surrounded by space for the crowd. Veyron had planned this as theater, public humiliation followed by public execution. Time to turn his theater into a battlefield. Kael turned to his small team. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk down to that courtyard. We're going to stand on that platform, and we're going to force Veyron to face us in front of the entire kingdom. One of the soldiers spoke up. Your Highness, that's suicide. He's got 200 men down there. We've got 8. Then the odds are almost fair. He looked at each of them in turn. I'm not ordering you to follow me. This isn't about duty anymore. This is personal. If you want to walk away, do it now. No judgment, no consequences. None of them moved. Kael felt something in his chest expand. These men didn't follow him because they feared him. They followed him because he'd finally given them something worth following. Then let's go remind Veyron that thrones aren't claimed by betrayal. They're held by the people willing to bleed for them. They move through the palace like ghosts. Kael knew which corridors would be watched, which routes Veyron would expect. So he took none of them. Instead, they went through the royal chambers, through his mother's old quarters that had been sealed since her death, through passages that only the royal family knew existed. They emerged in the courtyard just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. 200 soldiers turned to stare. Chancellor Veyron stood on the trial platform, flanked by his commanders. His expression shifted from confident to shocked to calculating in the space of a heartbeat. Kael walked forward, Celine at his side, 8 soldiers at his back. His wounds were screaming. His body was running on adrenaline and fury. But he walked like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Because he did. He'd been born to this kingdom, had bled for it, had sacrificed pieces of his humanity to keep it running. And he'd be damned if some bureaucrat with delusions of power was going to take it from him. He stopped at the base of the platform, looking up at Veyron. You wanted a trial, Chancellor? Let's have one. Right here. Right now. In front of everyone. Veyron's face hardened. Arrest them. All of them. Nobody moved. Kael smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. It was the smile of a predator who just realized his prey was cornered. Funny thing about loyalty, Chancellor. You can buy it, you can force it, but you can't fake it. And right now your soldiers are wondering if they're on the right side. He raised his voice, addressing the crowd. This man, he pointed at Veyron, betrayed your prince, sold your kingdom to the southern territories, orchestrated a coup because he decided you needed a different ruler. He didn't ask you, didn't earn your support, just decided your voice didn't matter. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Varen's expression darkened. You're a fool, Kyle. You think a speech will save you? I have the Southern Army backing me. I have half your nobles in my pocket. You have nothing but empty words and 8 soldiers. Kyle climbed onto the platform. Every step sent agony through his ribs, but he didn't let it show. You're right. I've got nothing. No army, no allies, no political leverage. He stopped in front of Varen, close enough to see the calculation in the older man's eyes. But I've got something you never will. I've got a reason to fight that's bigger than ambition or power or control. What's that? The people I'm fighting for actually matter. Kyle turned to face the crowd, his back deliberately exposed to Varen. I'm not a good man. I've done terrible things to keep this kingdom running. I've been cruel when I should have been kind. I've chosen fear over compassion. I've made mistakes that cost lives. His voice carried across the silent courtyard. But I'm done pretending that makes me strong. Real strength isn't killing your emotions. It's choosing to care even when caring makes you vulnerable. It's standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. It's admitting when you're wrong and trying to do better. He looked at Celine. I learned that from an Omega woman who refused to kneel. Who showed me that power without humanity is just tyranny wearing a crown. He turned back to Varen. So here's what's going to happen, Chancellor. You're going to step down. You're going to surrender. And you're going to face trial for treason. Or we're going to fight. Right here. Right now. Winner takes the kingdom. Varen laughed. You can barely stand. Your wounds are bleeding through your shirt. You want to fight me? No, Kyle said. I want to fight for something that matters. There's a difference. He drew his sword despite the way his ribs protested. Choose, Chancellor. Surrender or die. The courtyard held its breath. Varen's hand moved toward his weapon, and the world exploded into violence. The first clash of steel echoed across the courtyard like a death knell. Varen was faster than Kyle expected. Decades of court politics hadn't dulled his combat training. His blade came in low, aiming for the still bleeding wound in Kyle's ribs. A calculated strike. Efficient. The kind of move that ended fights before they really began. Kyle twisted, feeling something tear in his side, and brought his sword up to deflect. The impact jarred through his arm, sent white-hot pain radiating from his shoulder. He'd fought injured before, but never this badly, never with this much riding on the outcome. Varen pressed the advantage, driving forward with a combination that forced Kyle backward across the platform. Each movement cost something. Each parry drained reserves Kyle didn't have. The 200 soldiers watching didn't intervene. They just stood there, silent witnesses to a fight that would determine who ruled them. Some still wore Varen's colors. Others looked uncertain, torn between orders and instinct. Celine stood at the platform's edge, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Kyle could feel her fear like a physical presence, could see her fighting the urge to intervene, but she understood what he'd understood the moment he climbed onto this platform. Some battles you had to fight alone, not because others couldn't help, but because the fight itself was the point. Varen's blade found an opening, scored a line across Kyle's forearm. Blood welled up, hot and immediate. You're dying on your feet, the Chancellor said, circling. Why prolong it? Surrender now and I'll make it quick. Kyle adjusted his grip, ignored the way his vision was starting to tunnel. Because quick deaths don't teach lessons, and you need to learn what happens when you mistake patience for weakness. He attacked, no longer defending but driving forward with everything he had left. It was reckless, the kind of aggressive assault that left him vulnerable, but desperation had a way of clarifying strategy. Either he ended this now, or he didn't end it at all. Varen blocked, but Kyle could see the surprise in his eyes. The Chancellor had expected a wounded prince to fight conservatively, to try to outlast him. Instead, Kyle was fighting like a man with nothing to lose, which was accurate because he didn't. Everything that mattered was already at risk. Their blades locked. They stood face to face, close enough that Kyle could see the sweat on Varen's forehead, the first flicker of doubt in his expression. You taught me everything about ruling, Kyle said through gritted teeth. How to read people, how to manipulate loyalty, how to turn fear into obedience. But you never taught me the one thing that actually matters. And what's that? How to care about something more than winning. Kyle twisted, used Varen's own momentum against him. and drove his blade through the older man's guard. The sword punched through Veyron's shoulder, missing anything vital but destroying his sword arm completely. The Chancellor's weapon clattered to the platform. He dropped to his knees, clutching the wound, his face gone white with shock and pain. The courtyard erupted in shouts. Soldiers surged forward, but none of them seemed to know which side they were supposed to be on anymore. Kael stood over Veyron, his sword at the man's throat. His entire body was shaking with exhaustion and blood loss, but his hand was steady. "This is the part where I'm supposed to kill you," he said quietly, "where I make an example that ensures nobody ever tries this again. That's what you would do. That's what you taught me to do." "Then do it," Veyron spat. "Prove you're strong enough to rule." Kael looked down at the man who'd shaped a decade of his life. The man who'd stood beside him through wars and executions and every brutal decision required to maintain power. The man who'd betrayed everything the moment that power became inconvenient. There was a time when Kael would have killed him without hesitation, would have done it coldly, efficiently, sent a message written in blood that challenges to his authority, carried fatal consequences. That time was 3 weeks ago, before an Omega woman taught him that strength and cruelty weren't the same thing. "No," Kael said. The word fell into the courtyard like a stone into still water. Veyron stared up at him. "What? I'm not killing you. You're going to stand trial, face the same laws you used to condemn others, and then you're going to spend whatever years you have left remembering that mercy isn't weakness. It's a choice I'm making because I'm strong enough not to need your death." He lowered his sword. "Guards, take the Chancellor into custody, real custody this time, not whatever performance he arranged before." For a moment, nobody moved. Then one soldier stepped forward, then another, then a dozen, surrounding Veyron, disarming him, hauling him to his feet. The tide had turned, not through violence, but through a choice that proved violence wasn't the only option. Kael turned to face the assembled soldiers and courtiers who'd gathered to watch. His vision was getting blurry around the edges. He was losing blood faster than his body could compensate, probably had 10 minutes before he collapsed. "Time enough. Listen carefully," he said, his voice carrying despite the exhaustion. "Because I'm only explaining this once. This kingdom was built on fear. My grandfather ruled through fear. My father ruled through fear. I ruled through fear. And it worked for a while. Kept the borders secure, kept the nobles in line, kept everything running." He paused, gathering strength. "But fear is expensive. It costs everything you are to maintain it. It turns rulers into tyrants and kingdoms into prisons. I know, because I paid that price. Turned myself into something cold enough to survive, and it almost destroyed everything worth surviving for." The crowd was absolutely silent. "I'm done ruling through fear. Starting now, this kingdom operates on different principles. Protection instead of intimidation. Justice instead of revenge. Strength used to defend people, not control them." One of the nobles in the crowd called out, "And if that makes us weak? If other kingdoms see this as opportunity, then we'll defend ourselves." Kael's voice hardened. "But we'll do it as a kingdom worth defending, not as a collection of people too afraid to challenge their ruler." Another voice, from a soldier this time. "What about the children, the Omega orphans? They stay under royal protection, full citizenship, education, same opportunities as any child born to nobility. No exceptions, no workhouses, no exploitation." "And Miss Vale?" someone else asked. Kael looked at Celine. She was watching him with an expression that made his chest tighten despite the blood loss and pain. "Miss Vale is appointed Royal Advocate for Omega Rights. Position reports directly to the Crown. Her authority is my authority on matters concerning the treatment and protection of Omega citizens throughout all 6 territories." Celine's eyes went wide. Kael saw the protest forming on her lips, saw her about to argue that she didn't want titles or authority. He shook his head slightly. "Not now. They could argue about it later when he wasn't bleeding out in front of 200 witnesses." "Any other questions?" he asked the crowd. Silence. The kind that came from shock rather than satisfaction, but he'd take it. "Good. Then I suggest we all get back to rebuilding the kingdom we've been too busy fighting over to actually run properly." He turned to walk off the platform and immediately discovered that his legs had stopped cooperating. His vision went sideways. The ground rushed up to meet him. Strong arms caught him before he hit the wood. "Celine." Somehow she'd crossed the distance, and the half-second between standing and falling was holding him up through sheer determination and physics that didn't entirely make sense. "You couldn't just end dramatically on your feet?" she said, her voice shaking. "Had to add the collapse for effect?" "Not planned," Kyle managed. "Would have preferred to walk away." More dignified. "You're an idiot." Established fact. A physician pushed through the crowd, followed by guards carrying a stretcher. They eased Kyle onto it, despite his weak protests. Celine's hand found his, squeezed once, hard enough that it anchored him to consciousness. "Stay with me," she said quietly. "Not planning to leave. Not after I finally figured out what I'm fighting for." "Which is? You." Her breath caught. That's the blood loss talking. Maybe. But it's still true. They carried him through the palace corridors, Celine walking beside the stretcher the entire way. The physician was doing something with bandages and pressure points, muttering about idiots who fought duels with half-healed injuries. Kale let the words wash over him. He'd survived worse. Probably. The edges of his memory were getting fuzzy. They reached the royal chambers. The physician and his assistants went to work, cleaning wounds, applying fresh stitches, doing whatever mysterious things medical professionals did when princes insisted on bleeding everywhere. Kyle drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time he surfaced, Celine was there, sitting beside the bed, refusing to leave despite multiple people telling her the prince needed rest and privacy. Good. He didn't want privacy. He wanted to know she was real, that he hadn't dreamed the whole impossible situation of finding someone who made him want to be better than the weapon he'd spent 10 years becoming. The physician finally declared that Kyle would live, barring infection or catastrophic stupidity, and left with stern instructions about bed rest and not engaging in any more duels for at least 6 weeks. The room emptied. Just Kyle and Celine in the vast royal chamber that suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a space that could be transformed into something resembling home. Celine pulled a chair close to the bed. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood. His blood, mostly, from where she'd caught him on the platform. She looked exhausted and furious and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the fierce courage that radiated from her like heat. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever watched," she said. "Which part?" There were several contenders. All of it. Fighting when you could barely stand. Sparing Veyron when killing him would have been safer. Announcing massive policy changes while bleeding out in front of the entire court. Kale managed a weak smile. "Would you have preferred I maintained the status quo? I would have preferred you didn't almost die." Again. Noted for next time. There better not be a next time, can't promise that. Ruling kingdoms tends to involve occasional mortal peril. Celine was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "You really meant it. About the Omega protections. The children. All of it. Every word. Why?" "Because you were right. About everything. About how ruling through fear turns you into the kind of person nobody should want as a ruler. About how caring isn't weakness. About how the children deserve better than what this kingdom's been giving them." He met her eyes. "Because you made me want to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. And that man couldn't be the same person who looked at orphaned children and saw problems instead of people." Celine's breath hitched. "You can't just say things like that." "Why not?" "I almost died. That buys me at least one emotionally honest statement." "One? Don't push your luck." She laughed. It came out shaky, edged with the tears she'd been holding back. "You're impossible, and you're the only person in this kingdom brave enough to tell me that." Kale reached for her hand. She met him halfway, their fingers intertwining with the kind of certainty that comes from walking through fire together and discovering you're stronger combined than separate. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly, "and I need to say it now before I lose my nerve or pass out again." Celine waited. "I've spent 10 years believing that caring about anything was the fastest way to destroy myself. That love was a weapon people could use against me, so the safest option was to cut myself off from feeling anything. And it worked. I survived. Maintained power. Kept the kingdom functioning." He paused, gathering the words. "But surviving isn't living, and power without purpose is just violence wearing a crown. You taught me that. By refusing to break. By standing up to me when everyone else was too afraid. by showing me that the person I'd become wasn't the person I had to stay. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'm in love with you, Celine Vale. Not because you're convenient or strategic or politically useful. Because you're impossible and brave, and you make me want to be better than every version of myself I've been before. And I know that's terrifying. I know it makes us both vulnerable. But I'm done pretending vulnerability is the same as weakness. The silence that followed felt infinite. Then Celine said very quietly, You know I'm nobody, right? I'm an Omega from the slums with no family, no wealth, no status. The nobles are going to lose their minds when they realize you're serious about this. Let them. I didn't survive a war and a coup to start compromising on things that actually matter. I'm still going to argue with you. Good. I need someone who'll tell me when I'm being an idiot. And I'm not giving up my work with the children to become some decorative figurehead. I'm appointing you royal advocate. That's the opposite of decorative. This is insane. Everything about this situation is insane. Kael studied her face, seeing the fear and hope warring in her expression. Does that mean you're saying no? Celine looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, No, you impossible man. It means I'm saying yes. To all of it. The insanity, the arguments, the nobles losing their minds. The whole terrifying prospect of trying to build something real in a kingdom that runs on fear and violence. She squeezed his hand. Because I'm in love with you too. Even though you're arrogant and damaged, and you have the self-preservation instincts of a particularly suicidal wolf. Even though loving you means putting a target on my back for every noble who thinks Omegas should know their place. Even though this is probably going to be the hardest thing either of us has ever done. Why? Kael asked softly. Because you're also brave and loyal and willing to bleed for people who can't defend themselves. Because you're trying to become something better despite a decade of training in how to be something worse. Because when I look at you, I don't see the cruel prince everyone's afraid of. I see the man who risked everything to save 73 children nobody else cared about. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. Because you make me believe that broken things can be repaired. That kingdoms built on fear can learn to run on hope. That two people from completely different worlds can find something worth fighting for together. Kael's free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. I'm going to mess this up, he said. Probably multiple times. I've got 10 years of terrible habits and a kingdom full of people who expect me to be someone I'm not anymore. Then we'll figure it out together. Isn't that what you said on the platform? Together? Yeah. But I was bleeding out at the time. Might have been delusional. You were lucid enough to restructure the entire kingdom's approach to Omega rights while halfway to unconscious. I think you meant it. Probably did. They stayed like that, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air, neither quite willing to break the moment. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere in the palace, the children were safe. The guards were reorganizing. The nobles were trying to figure out what the new order meant for their power structures. But in this room, in this moment, it was just two people who'd survived impossible odds and found something more valuable than power or safety or any of the things they'd thought they needed. They found each other. Sword. 3 months later, the kingdom looked different. The changes came slowly at first, then gained momentum like a boulder rolling downhill. Omega protection laws passed through council with surprisingly little resistance once it became clear the prince wasn't backing down. The orphan children were officially adopted into royal care, given education and opportunities that previous generations would have thought impossible. Celine threw herself into her new role with the same fierce determination she'd brought to the sanctuary in the lower districts. Within weeks, she'd established a network of safe houses, training programs, and legal advocates across all 6 territories. The nobles grumbled. A few tried to resist. They stopped when the prince made it clear that his tolerance for corruption had evaporated along with his patience for political games. Some things changed faster than others. The palace itself felt different, less like a mausoleum and more like a place where people actually lived. The East Wing, where the children had first been housed, was converted into a proper school. Laughter echoed through corridors that hadn't heard joy in decades. Kael found himself relearning how to rule. It was harder than he'd expected, undoing 10 years of fear-based governance while maintaining enough authority to prevent chaos. But he had help. Celine called him on his worst instincts. The children reminded him what he was building toward. And slowly, painfully, he started to become the kind of leader he'd always dismissed as impossibly naive. Turned out naive and necessary weren't mutually exclusive. Tam appointed himself unofficial ambassador between the children and the prince. The kid had a gift for reading people, for knowing when Kael was sliding back into old patterns, when he needed a reminder about why the changes mattered. More than once, Kael found himself explaining policy decisions to a 10-year-old who had no political training but understood human nature better than most of his advisors. The Southern Territories, deprived of their inside man, attempted a border incursion 4 weeks after Veyron's arrest. Kael responded with a military precision that reminded everyone he was still capable of brutal efficiency when required. But the aftermath was different. Negotiations instead of executions, treaties instead of terror. The Southern commanders, expecting the prince they'd heard about, found themselves dealing with someone who preferred sustainable peace to temporary victory. It confused them enough that they actually agreed to his terms. Veyron stood trial 6 weeks after the coup attempt. The evidence was overwhelming: falsified documents, paid witnesses, coordination with foreign powers. The High Council debated for 3 days before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty of treason, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. The sentence should have been death. Previous princes would have made a spectacle of it. Kael commuted it to life imprisonment in the northern fortress. No visitors, no possibility of parole, but alive. Some of the nobles called it weakness. Kael called it refusing to become the kind of person who measured strength by body count. Celine called it growth. She was there the day they transported Veyron north, stood beside Kael as the former chancellor was led past them in chains. The old man looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of power and purpose. He stopped when he saw them, his expression complicated. "You should have killed me," he said to Kael. "Leaving enemies alive is the mistake that gets you killed later." "Maybe," Kael said, "but living in a cell for the next 20 years knowing I was strong enough to spare you seems like a worse punishment than a quick death. And I'm learning to think long-term." Veyron's eyes shifted to Celine. "This is your influence. You've made him soft." "No," Celine said quietly. "I helped him remember that soft and weak aren't the same thing, that mercy from a position of strength is more terrifying to your enemies than casual cruelty." The former chancellor studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once, as close to respect as someone like him could manage. "You might actually succeed," he said, "or you might both be dead within the year. History will decide which." "Then I guess we'll make history worth remembering," Kael said. They watched him loaded into the transport wagon, watched it rumble away toward the northern mountains, watched the physical embodiment of a decade of his life disappear into the distance. "How do you feel?" Celine asked quietly. Kael considered the question. "Like I just closed a door I've been standing in for too long. It's going to take time to learn how to live in the room beyond it. But you're going to try." "Yeah, with you. If you're still willing to put up with the learning curve." Celine took his hand, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "I signed up for the whole journey, not just the easy parts." "Good, because I have a feeling none of this is going to be easy." He was right. The nobles continued to resist certain reforms. The economic restructuring required to fund the new protections put strain on treasury reserves. Foreign kingdoms watched with varying degrees of suspicion and calculation, trying to determine if the changes made Moonfang stronger or more vulnerable. But underneath the complications, something fundamental had shifted. The kingdom was learning to run on different fuel. Not fear, but investment. People protecting systems because those systems protected them back. It was messy and imperfect and required constant adjustment, but it was also sustainable in ways the old model never was. 2 months after Veyron's transport, Kael stood in the palace gardens with Celine and watched the children play. 73 kids who should have been lost to the war, now laughing and fighting and being children in ways they'd been denied for too long. Tam broke away from the group and ran over, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see? Did you see my throw? I hit the target 3 times in a row." "I saw," Kael said. The kid had taken to archery training with single-minded determination. "Keep practicing and you'll qualify for the junior guard program by next year." Tam beamed. Then his expression got serious, the way it did when he was about to say something important. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." Are you and Miss Celine going to get married? Kale glanced at Celine. She was trying very hard not to smile. I haven't asked her yet, he said carefully. Why not? Because I'm trying to figure out the right way to do it. Your Miss Celine isn't the kind of person who'd appreciate a big public spectacle. Ask her now, Tam said with the certainty of someone who'd never experienced romantic complications. Just ask. The worst she can do is say no. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. Then you're being stupid. Miss Celine loves you. Everyone knows it. Even the kitchen staff talk about it. Kale looked at Celine. She was definitely smiling now. The kitchen staff, really? Apparently we're the favorite topic of conversation below stairs, Celine said. Right up there with whose turn it is to clean the ovens? Flattering. I think so. Tam was looking between them with growing impatience. So, are you going to ask her, or do I have to do it for you? Kale felt something in his chest loosen. All his planning, all his worrying about protocol and timing and finding the perfect moment, and a 10-year-old had just called him out for overthinking. Maybe the right moment wasn't some grand gesture. Maybe it was just this. Standing in a garden, surrounded by children who represented everything they'd fought for, with the person who'd taught him that vulnerability was a form of strength. He turned to face Celine fully. She was watching him with an expression that said she knew exactly where this was going and was trying to decide whether to let him suffer or help him out. I'm terrible at this, he said. At what, specifically? You're terrible at many things. Romance, emotional vulnerability, asking for things I want instead of just taking them. Celine's smile softened. You're getting better. Not fast enough. Kale took a breath. 3 months ago, you walked into my palace and destroyed everything I thought I knew about power and strength and survival. You refused to back down. You fought for children nobody else cared about. You stood up to me when everyone else was too afraid. You made me want to be better than the person I'd become. He took her hands. I'm still learning how to do this. How to rule without fear. How to care about things without using that care as a weapon. How to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. And I'm going to mess up, probably a lot. But I'd like to mess up with you beside me, officially, permanently. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the way several children gasped and the garden suddenly got very quiet. Celine Vale, will you marry me? The silence stretched. Celine was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she said, You're proposing to me in a garden full of children without a ring. Didn't think that far ahead, and you're still recovering from injuries sustained 3 months ago. Your knee is probably screaming right now. Little bit, yeah, and you just said you're going to mess up a lot. That's possibly the worst sales pitch for marriage I've ever heard. Probably. Celine pulled him to his feet with surprising strength for someone half his size. Her eyes were bright, somewhere between laughter and tears. Yes, you impossible, damaged, absolutely infuriating man. Yes, I'll marry you. The children erupted in cheers. Tam was jumping up and down like he'd personally orchestrated the entire thing. Kyle pulled Celine close, his forehead resting against hers in the gesture that had become theirs. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For seeing something worth saving in me. For refusing to give up. For making me believe broken things could be repaired. We're both broken, Celine said. We're just broken in ways that fit together. She was right. They were both scarred, both carrying damage from lives that had demanded too much too young. But somehow, impossibly, they'd found a way to turn that damage into something that made them stronger together than separate. The wedding took place 6 weeks later. Against tradition, Celine insisted it be held in the lower districts where she'd run her sanctuary. Not the palace. Not some grand cathedral. The streets where she'd learned that survival required community and that compassion wasn't a luxury but a necessity. The nobles were scandalized. Kyle didn't care. Some battles were worth losing politically to win personally. The ceremony was simple. Vows exchanged in a plaza that had seen too much poverty and not enough celebration. But it was packed. People from all 6 territories. Nobles and commoners standing side by side, united by curiosity if not acceptance. And the children. All 73 of them, dressed in their best clothes, sitting in the front row like honored family. Kyle stood at the altar, a temporary structure built for the occasion, and watched Celine walk toward him. She wore a simple dress, pale blue like dawn sky, with flowers woven through her hair. No crown. No jewels. Just herself. fierce and beautiful and impossible. The officiant led them through vows, traditional words about loyalty and honor. But when it came time for personal statements, Kyle looked at Celine and spoke from a place deeper than protocol. I spent 10 years learning how to survive without caring about anything. You taught me how to live by caring about everything. I can't promise I'll be perfect. Can't promise I won't fall back into old habits or make decisions that hurt people, but I can promise that I'll try, every day, to be worthy of the faith you've shown in me, to build the kingdom we both believe is possible, to love you with everything I've managed to repair from the broken pieces you first met. Celine's vows were shorter, but they hit just as hard. I promise to keep arguing with you when you're wrong, to stand beside you when you're right, to remind you that caring isn't weakness and that mercy isn't the same as surrender, to help you build something worth protecting, and to love you not despite your damage, but because your willingness to heal from it makes you the strongest person I know. They sealed it with a kiss that lasted long enough for the children to start giggling and the nobles to shift uncomfortably and the crowd to break into applause that echoed off the surrounding buildings. And Kyle realized something that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. He was happy, not the grim satisfaction of tactical victory, not the cold pleasure of enemies defeated, actual happiness, the kind that came from building something with someone instead of standing alone at the top of a pyramid made from fear. The reception lasted until dawn, music and dancing and too much wine. The children ran wild through the plaza, drunk on sugar and excitement. The nobles gradually relaxed as they realized this strange Omega Queen wasn't going to demand their immediate execution. Common folk celebrated because they'd never seen royalty act like actual people before. And in the middle of it all, Kyle and Celine danced, holding each other like they were the only two people who existed. "This is going to be complicated," Celine said quietly. "Ruling together, figuring out how to balance your authority with my advocacy. The nobles are already plotting ways to undermine me. Let them plot. We've survived worse." Have we, though? Political intrigue is different from open combat. Slower, more insidious. Then we'll learn how to fight it. Together. That word again. Getting used to it? Slowly. Good. Because you're stuck with me now. Legally binding vows and everything. Celine laughed, and the sound was everything Cale had never let himself hope for. Joy. Unguarded. Real. The kingdom was still a mess. The reforms were fragile. The nobles were waiting for any sign of weakness. Foreign powers were calculating whether to test the new order. There were 1,000 problems that needed solving and not enough hours in the day to solve them all. But standing in that plaza, holding the woman who'd saved him by refusing to let him stay saved, Kyle felt something he hadn't felt in 10 years. Hope. Not the naive kind that ignored reality. The hard-earned kind that acknowledged every scar and still believed healing was possible. That broken kingdoms could be rebuilt. That people who'd learned to survive through fear could learn to live through something better. And if hope was dangerous, if it made him vulnerable in ways he'd spent a decade avoiding, then maybe vulnerability was the point. Maybe being strong enough to choose softness was the real test of power. Maybe the greatest act of defiance was refusing to let the world's brutality turn you brutal. Tam appeared at his elbow, tugging on his sleeve. "What happens now?" the boy asked. "Now we go back to the palace and start the real work," Cale said. "Building the kingdom we talked about. Making sure kids like you have better options than we did. And you'll still be the prince?" "I'll still be the prince, but I'm trying to be a different kind. The kind who protects instead of threatens, who listens instead of demands, who admits when he's wrong and works to fix it. That sounds hard." "Yeah, but worth it." Tam considered this. Then he said, with the wisdom of someone who'd lost everything and survived anyway, "I think your mom would be proud of what you're becoming." The words hit harder than any sword ever had. Kael felt his throat tighten, felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed since he was 12 years old. "Thank you," he managed. Tam nodded once, then ran off to rejoin the other children, leaving Kael standing there with tears he didn't try to hide. Celine found his hand again. "You okay?" He looked at her, at the plaza full of people celebrating despite their damage, at the children playing in streets that had known too much poverty, at the kingdom spread out around them, broken and beautiful and fighting to become something better. "Yeah," he said, "I think I actually am." And for the first time in his life, he meant it. The story could have ended there, with a wedding and hope and the promise of better days. But real stories don't end when the music stops. They keep going. Day after day, choice after choice, testing whether the transformation was real or just a pretty moment before sliding back into old patterns. The test came 3 weeks after the wedding. A delegation from the Eastern Territories arrived with complaints about Omega Protections cutting into labor profits. They were polite but firm. The reforms were too extreme, too fast, bad for business. They wanted exemptions, carve-outs, anything that would let them maintain the systems they'd built fortunes on. The old Kael would have made a tactical calculation, would have found a compromise that gave them enough to stay loyal while maintaining the appearance of progress, would have sold out principles for stability. The new Kael sat across from them with Celine at his side and said, no. Not negotiable, not up for debate. The protections stood, and any territory that couldn't operate without exploitation was welcome to restructure their business models or face economic sanctions. The delegation left furious. 2 of them threatened to break from the kingdom entirely. Celine waited until they were alone before asking, "Are you sure about this? Losing the Eastern Territories would be catastrophic economically." "I'm sure," Kael said, "because if I compromise on this, then everything we've built means nothing. If protection only applies when it's convenient, then it's not protection. It's just better marketing for the same old cruelty. Even if it costs you half the kingdom, especially then, because that's when principles actually matter, when defending them costs something." Celine studied his face. Then she smiled, and it was fierce and proud. "Okay, then let's figure out how to survive losing the Eastern Territories while maintaining everything else. Together? Always together." They didn't lose the Eastern Territories. Not entirely. 3 of the 5 stayed after realizing the prince wasn't bluffing and restructuring was cheaper than rebellion. The other 2 attempted to break away, discovered that independence was harder than anticipated, and came crawling back within 6 months with significantly less leverage. And through it all, Kael learned what it actually meant to rule from a place of principle instead of fear. It was harder, required more work, more negotiation, more willingness to admit when strategies failed and try something different. But it was also sustainable in ways the old model never was, because people fighting to protect a system that protected them back didn't need to be terrorized into loyalty. They just needed to see that the system was worth protecting. Slowly, impossibly, the kingdom transformed. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough that 5 years later, when Kael looked around at what they'd built, he barely recognized it as the same place. The orphan children were grown. Tam was training for officer commission in the Royal Guard. Mira was studying law, determined to become an advocate like Celine. Others had scattered across the territories, carrying with them the message that Omega children could become something other than what the old world said they had to be. New children arrived regularly at the palace schools. Some were orphans. Others were just kids from families too poor to afford education. All were welcomed. All were given chances their parents never had. The nobility still grumbled, but quietly. They'd learned that the prince who'd spared Veyron could still be brutal when necessary, and that mercy wasn't the same as weakness. A few had even started implementing similar reforms in their own territories, less from altruism than from recognition that the new model actually worked. And through all of it, Kael and Celine ruled together. Not without conflict. They argued constantly, challenged each other, pushed back when they thought the other was wrong. But they did it as partners, neither submitting to the other, both stronger for the tension that kept them sharp. On their 5th anniversary, they returned to the lower district plaza where they'd married. It looked different now, cleaner, more prosperous. The poverty was still there. You couldn't erase generations of neglect in 5 years, but it was less desperate, more manageable. They walked through streets where Celine had once run her sanctuary, holding hands like commoners instead of royalty. "Do you ever regret it?" Celine asked. "Giving up the kind of power your father had? The ability to just command and have people obey without question?" Kael considered the question seriously. Every day. It would be so much easier to just intimidate people into compliance, would solve problems faster. He paused. "But then I remember what that version of me cost. How empty everything felt. How I couldn't tell anymore if people followed me out of loyalty or terror. How I was turning into exactly what my father was, powerful and alone, and slowly dying inside without realizing it. He looked at her. You gave me the choice to become something else, something harder but better. I don't regret that. Even on the days when everything's falling apart and I'm exhausted and I just want to make one decision without having to justify it to 17 different constituencies. Celine smiled. Those are my favorite days. When you're at your most tyrannical and I get to remind you why we do it the hard way. You're a menace. You knew that when you married me. Best decision I ever made. They stopped in front of the building that had housed Celine's sanctuary. It was a school now, funded by the Crown, teaching children who'd never had access to education before. Through the windows, they could see a classroom, a teacher at the front, students bent over books, learning, growing, becoming something more than survival demanded. That's why we do it, Celine said quietly. Not for the easy days. For that. For every kid in that room who gets a chance we never had. We had chances, Kael said, just different kinds. Mine came from being born to power. Yours came from refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. And together we're trying to make sure future generations get both, power and refusal, authority and compassion. Is it working? Kael looked around at the district that had changed, at the children in the school, at the woman beside him who'd made all of it possible. Yeah, he said. I think it actually is. They stood there as the sun set over the kingdom they'd fought to transform. Not perfect, not fixed, but better than it was, moving toward something worth the cost. And Kyle realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not defeating every enemy, not solving every problem, just making progress, just building something that would outlast them, just proving that broken things could be repaired if you were willing to do the work. The kingdom of Moonfang would never be perfect. It carried too much history, too much damage, too many competing interests. But it could be better. And better was enough. Because in the end, that's all anyone could do. Take the world as it was, brutal and beautiful and impossible, and try to leave it slightly less broken than you found it. And maybe, if you were lucky enough to find someone who believed in the same impossible things, you didn't have to do it alone. Kale looked at Celine. She was watching the sunset, her profile sharp against the dying light. And he felt the same fierce certainty he'd felt 5 years ago when she'd first walked into his palace and refused to kneel. This was what he'd been looking for all along. Not power, not control, not the cold satisfaction of enemies defeated. Just this, someone to stand beside, a kingdom worth protecting, and the hard-earned knowledge that the fiercest roar didn't come from dominance. It came from having the courage to care when caring made you vulnerable, to fight when fighting cost everything, to love despite the damage it might cause, and to believe, against all evidence to the contrary, that broken things could be made whole again. One impossible choice at a time.